roughly 55 million years ago, when the land that would become northern France was not land at all, but the floor of a warm, shallow tropical sea. For millions of years, this marine environment teemed with life, and as these organisms perished, their calcium-rich shells and skeletons drifted down to form a thick blanket of sediment on the seabed. This process laid down the foundational stone of the future city, Lutetian limestone, a porous and fossil-rich rock that would one day be quarried to build cathedrals and palaces. It's hard to believe that this is the place that gave birth to one of the most iconic cities in the entire human history, Paris. The sea did not remain constant. Its shoreline advanced and retreated with subtle shifts in the Earth's crust, creating vast coastal lagoons. As the seawater in these isolated basins evaporated under the intense Eocene sun, it left behind thick deposits of gypsum. This mineral, later mined and heated, would become famous throughout the world as plaster of Paris, a material intrinsically linked to the city's artistic and architectural identity. Overlying these layers, finer particles settled in the tranquil waters, forming beds of soft marl and impermeable clay, creating a stratified geology of alternating hard and soft layers, a layer cake of ancient time. The pivotal transformation began as a distant consequence of a continental collision far to the south. The immense tectonic forces that pushed Africa into Europe, giving birth to the Alps, caused the entire region of the Paris Basin to gently dome upwards. This slow, inexorable uplift, occurring over millions of years, forced the final retreat of the ancient sea and exposed the newly formed sedimentary rock to the air for the first time. The uplift created a vast, saucer-like depression, a basin tilted slightly towards the English Channel. Water, now in the form of rain and runoff, began to seek the lowest point of this new landscape. Small streams coalesced into larger channels, and eventually the ancestral Seine River was born. Finding its path dictated by the gentle slope of the basin, the river began its patient work of erosion. For millennia upon millennia, the Seine and its tributaries, the Marne and the Oise, meandered across the plateau, carving their way down through the layers of rock. The river cut easily through the soft clays and marls, but was slowed by the harder strata of Lutetian limestone. This differential erosion sculpted the landscape, creating the wide river valley and the series of gentle hills, or buttes, like Montmartre and Belleville, that would one day define the topography of the city. The river did not just carve a channel, it created the very stage upon which all of Paris's future history would unfold. Just a quick announcement. If you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. Long after the geological stage was set, the first human presence in the Paris Basin appeared as a faint and scattered echo. During the Upper Paleolithic period, the landscape was a vast, cold steppe, shaped by the advances and retreats of distant ice sheets. This was the world of Neanderthals, and later Cro-Magnons, nomadic groups who left fleeting evidence of their existence. In gravel pits along the Seine and its tributaries, archaeologists have unearthed their material culture. Bifacial hand axes, flint scrapers for cleaning hides, and sharp-edged flakes used for butchering the great mammals that roamed the tundra, such as woolly mammoths, reindeer, and wild horses. Sites like those at Pinsevent and Étioles, southeast of the modern city, provide remarkable snapshots of these Magdalenian hunter camps. Here, around ancient hearths, flint knappers left behind thousands of stone fragments, allowing researchers to reconstruct their precise techniques for creating long, elegant blades, a testament to a sophisticated and highly organized way of life, dependent on the seasonal migration of animal herds. As the last ice age receded around 10,000 BCE, a profound environmental shift occurred. The climate warmed, and dense forests of oak and elm grew where the open steppe had once been. The great herds of the Ice Age vanished, replaced by smaller, more solitary forest animals like red deer, wild boar, and aurochs. This new environment demanded new strategies for survival from the Mesolithic peoples who inhabited it. Their toolkit adapted accordingly, featuring smaller, more specialized flint implements known as microliths. These tiny, sharp blades were hafted onto wood or bone to create composite tools like barbed harpoons for fishing in the now slower, warmer Seine, and arrows for hunting in the dense woodlands. These were still transient communities, but their movements became more localized, tethered to the rich resources of the river valley. The most significant transformation came with the Neolithic Revolution, beginning around the 5th millennium BCE. The concepts of agriculture and animal domestication, spreading from the Near East, arrived in the region, bringing an end to the purely hunter-gatherer existence. People began to clear forests to plant early forms of wheat and barley, and they herded the first domesticated cattle, sheep, and pigs. This shift is marked in the archaeological record by the appearance of polished stone axes, essential for felling trees, and the first rudimentary pottery, used for storing grain and cooking. While grand megalithic monuments were being erected in other parts of France, the evidence in the Paris basin points to a more practical focus. The remains of a settled Neolithic village dating back to between 4500 and 3800 BCE were found. Excavations revealed the outlines of large wooden houses, along with tools, pottery, and even a preserved wooden canoe, the oldest ever found in the region. This was no longer a temporary camp, but a permanent community, a society of the first Parisian farmers, living and dying on the banks of the Seine, laying down the first anonymous human foundation for the city to come. The centuries leading up to the Roman era saw the Paris basin become part of a wider cultural movement known as the Latin period, the height of the European Iron Age. It was during this time, around the middle of the 3rd century BCE, that a Celtic-speaking Gallic tribe known as the Parisii migrated into the middle Seine Valley. They brought with them advanced ironworking skills and a sophisticated social structure. But their defining characteristic was their intimate relationship with the river. They established their primary settlement, or oppidum, on the largest island in the river, the Île de la Cité. This location was a masterful strategic choice. The surrounding waters of the Seine offered a natural moat, a formidable defense that made the settlement easily protectable. More importantly, the island commanded a crucial crossroads of both land and water-based trade routes, allowing the Parisii to control the flow of goods and collect tolls from passing traffic. The entire economy of the Parisii was built upon the river. They were skilled boatmen, constructing vessels capable of navigating the Seine and its tributaries to engage in a thriving long-distance trade network. From their island hub, they facilitated the movement of tin, a vital component for bronze, brought from Britain down to the Mediterranean world. In the opposite direction, they imported luxury goods from the south, such as wine from Massalia and fine pottery. The river was not a boundary, but a highway, and their control of its key bridges and crossing points gave them significant economic and political power over the surrounding region. Archaeological finds from this period include not just local pottery and tools, but also artifacts from distant Gallic tribes, confirming the settlement's role as a commercial nexus. The most striking evidence of the Parisii's prosperity and organization is their remarkable coinage. Beginning around 100 BCE, they began to mint their own gold staters, coins of exceptional artistic quality. These coins were not crude imitations of Greek or Roman models, but possessed a unique and highly stylized aesthetic. The obverse typically features a highly abstract and swirling depiction of a human head, often identified as the god Apollo, while the reverse shows an equally stylized horse, seemingly in motion, with a canopy or pattern above it. The production of such high-purity gold currency indicates a powerful centralized authority capable of sourcing the precious metal and regulating its minting. It was a clear statement of their tribal identity, economic strength, and political independence. These small, intricate objects, lost and rediscovered centuries later, serve as the most tangible link to this pre-Roman society of river traders who gave the future capital its name. The independent existence of the Parisii was drawn into a far larger geopolitical conflict, with the arrival of Julius Caesar's legions in Gaul in 58 BCE. For the first few years of the Gallic Wars, the Parisii remained relatively peripheral to the main theatres of combat. However, their strategic position astride the Seine did not go unnoticed by the Roman general. Our primary, though heavily biased, account of these events comes from Caesar's own Commentarii de Bello Gallico, where he records his campaign with meticulous self-serving detail. He noted the Parisii oppidum, which he called Lutetia, as a significant obstacle, its island location making a direct assault difficult, and its control of the river a threat to Roman supply lines moving north. The decisive moment came in 52 BCE, during the Great Gallic Revolt, led by the Arvernian chieftain Vercingetorix. In a general council of the Gallic tribes, the Parisii made the fateful decision to join the Pan-Gallic uprising, contributing their warriors to the cause of Gallic independence. This act transformed them from neutral observers into active enemies of Rome. With Caesar himself besieging Vercingetorix at the main stronghold of Alesia, he could not afford a hostile force to remain active in his rear, threatening his communications and supply routes along the major river systems. Consequently, he dispatched his most senior and trusted legate, Titus Labienus, with 4 legions, a substantial force of nearly 20 men to neutralize the Parisii and their allies, the Senones. The Gallic forces, under the command of an experienced and respected elder named Camulogenus, employed a shrewd initial strategy. Understanding the defensive limitations of the island against a full-scale Roman assault, Camulogenus ordered the evacuation of Lutetia. The Parisii burned their own settlement and the vital wooden bridges connecting it to the banks, denying Labienus both a strategic prize and an easy river crossing. The Gallic army then established a strong defensive position in the marshlands on the south bank of the Seine, forcing the Romans to confront them on terrain that favoured the defenders. Labienus, a master of Roman tactical doctrine, refused to be drawn into a costly battle in the swamps. Instead, he executed a classic Roman maneuver of deception. He marched his main force noisily upriver, creating the impression of a retreat, which drew the Gallic army out of their fortified marshland position to shadow them along the opposite bank. Under the cover of a storm and darkness, Labienus secretly sent a detachment of his troops back downriver on commandeered boats to secure a crossing. He then force-marched the rest of his legions back to the same point. The Gallic forces, realizing they had been outmaneuvered, were caught in the open plain, likely in the area of the modern Champ de Mars. The ensuing battle was a brutal, decisive engagement. The Gauls fought with great courage, and their commander Camulogenus fell in the front lines, but the discipline and superior tactics of the Roman legions prevailed. The defeat of the Parisii was absolute, shattering their military power and ending their independence forever, bringing the future site of Paris firmly under the gaze and control of Rome. Following the decisive Roman victory in 52 BCE, the ashes of the Parisii oppidum on the Ile de la Cité did not smoulder for long. Roman military engineers and administrators immediately recognized the enduring strategic value of the location. The military imperative was clear: to secure the crucial Seine River crossing and prevent the island from ever again becoming a center of Gallic resistance. The first act of Roman consolidation was the reconstruction of the 2 vital bridges that the Gauls had destroyed. Utilizing their advanced engineering techniques, the Romans built more permanent structures, likely with stone piers and timber roadways, establishing a durable link in the road network that connected the provincial capital of Lugdunum to the north. With the river crossing secured, the island was repurposed from a tribal stronghold into a base for Roman administration and control. A new town was formally founded, given the name Lutetia Parisiorum. The name itself was a declaration of the new order. Lutetia was the Roman designation, while the suffix Parisiorum, meaning of the Parisii, signified its administrative function. It was not established as a colonia, a settlement for retired Roman legionaries, but as the capital of the Civitas Parisiorum, the self-governing district of the now pacified Parisii tribe. This was a standard Roman imperial policy, to defeat a tribe militarily, then co-opt its surviving aristocracy into the Roman administrative system, granting them a degree of local autonomy in exchange for loyalty, taxes, and peace. The initial layout of Roman Lutetia was confined primarily to the Ile de la Cité. On the cleared ground of the former oppidum, Roman surveyors implemented a rational grid plan, a stark contrast to the organic layout of the Gallic settlement. This initial grid was modest, dictated by the island's small size, but it established the core of the new town with a central axis aligned with the main north-south road that crossed the two new bridges. A small forum, a basilica for administrative and judicial functions, and a temple were likely among the first public structures to be built, serving as the nucleus of Roman civic life. While the island served as the secure administrative heart, the Romans quickly recognized its limitations for expansion. The true future of the Gallo-Roman city would lie not on the cramped island fortress, but on the higher, drier, and more spacious ground of the left bank, setting the stage for the city's first major expansion beyond its original island cradle. The true physical and ideological imprint of Rome on Lutetia began not on the island, but on the gentle slopes of the left bank. Roman urban planning was a science of order, a process of imposing a rational structure onto the natural landscape. Surveyors, known as agrimensors, used instruments like the groma to lay out a precise orthogonal grid of streets, creating rectangular city blocks called insulae. This grid was the fundamental skeleton of the new city. The primary north-south artery, the Cardo Maximus, was a direct extension of the major Roman road from the south, running straight down the slope of what would become the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, crossing the Ile de la Cité, and continuing north. This road, the ancestor of the modern Rue Saint-Jacques, was the city's backbone, integrating Lutetia into the vast network of the Roman Empire. A main east-west street, the Decumanus Maximus, intersected the Cardo at a right angle, establishing the center of the new urban development and providing the framework for all subsequent construction. This rational street plan required pavement, drainage, and a level of engineering far beyond what the Gauls had employed. Streets were carefully paved with large stone blocks, flanked by covered porticos and gutters to manage rainwater. This imposition of stone and order was a visible statement of Roman permanence and control. However, for a Roman city to thrive, it needed more than organized streets. It required a constant and reliable supply of fresh water. The Seine was a source for commerce and a barrier for defense, but it was not suitable for the hygienic and civic needs of a Roman populace, who expected public baths, fountains, and clean drinking water. To meet this demand, Roman engineers undertook the construction of a sophisticated aqueduct, sourcing water from the clean springs of the Rungis and Wissus area, nearly 16 kilometers to the south. They engineered a channel that followed a gentle, carefully calculated gradient to bring water to the city purely by the force of gravity. The majority of the aqueduct was a subterranean stone-lined channel, protecting the water from contamination, but where it needed to cross valleys, like that of the Bièvre River, it was carried on impressive masonry arches. The remains of these arches are still visible today in the modern suburb of Arcueil, a testament to the scale of this undertaking. This single aqueduct delivered an estimated 2 million gallons of water into Lutetia every day, feeding the city's great public bath complexes and ensuring a level of public health and civic amenity that was the hallmark of Roman civilization. Stone, water, and order were the three elements Rome used to transform a Gallic river crossing into a functioning provincial city. With the essential infrastructure of streets and water established, the left bank rapidly evolved into the public heart of Lutetia Parisiorum. This development was a deliberate expression of Roman civic culture, embodied in a series of monumental stone structures designed for administration, hygiene, and public spectacle. At the summit of the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, near the intersection of the Cardo and Decumanus, the Romans erected the Forum. This large rectangular complex oriented to the cardinal points was the city's political, judicial, and commercial nucleus. It consisted of an open paved square surrounded by a colonnade, which served as a public meeting place and market. On one side stood the basilica, a large roofed hall where law courts convened and civic administrators conducted their business. Opposite this was the main temple, dedicated to the official state cult, likely Jupiter or the deified emperor, cementing the link between local governance and imperial authority. Civic life was not limited to politics and law. It was deeply intertwined with public health and social interaction, which centered on the grand public baths, or thermae. Lutetia boasted several bath complexes, the most significant of which were the Thermes de Cluny, whose substantial remains are still a prominent feature of modern Paris. Fed by the aqueduct, these baths were marvels of engineering, featuring a complex hypercaust system where hot air from furnaces circulated under the floors and through the walls to heat the various rooms. Citizens would progress through the cold room frigidarium, the warm room tepidarium, and the hot room caldarium, not just for bathing, but to socialize, conduct business, exercise in the adjacent palestra, and read in the libraries. They were essential institutions of Roman daily life, accessible to all social classes. For public entertainment, two major structures were built on the slopes of the left bank. A Roman theatre, designed for dramatic performances, was constructed with the classic semicircular seating arrangement, likely using the natural incline of the hill to support its tiered seats. More prominent were the arenas of Lutetia, a massive structure with a capacity estimated at over 15,000 spectators. It was a hybrid design common in Gaul, combining a Roman amphitheatre for gladiatorial combat and animal hunts with a stage for theatrical productions. Its elliptical arena and stone terraces provided the populace with the brutal spectacles that were a cornerstone of Roman entertainment and social control. Together, the forum, baths, and arenas formed a constellation of public monuments that defined Lutetia as a thoroughly Romanized city, providing its Gallo-Roman inhabitants with the complete architectural vocabulary of imperial civic life. While the monumental stone structures of the left bank proclaimed the public dominance of Roman state paganism, a new and illicit faith began to circulate within Lutetia's private spaces. Christianity arrived not as a grand procession, but as a quiet and dangerous whisper, carried along the same trade routes that brought goods and soldiers to the city. During the turbulent mid-3rd century, a period of intense imperial persecution, the historical figure of Dionysius of Paris, later known as Saint Denis, was traditionally sent from Rome to organize the small scattered Christian flock in Lutetia. This mission, undertaken around 250 AD during the reign of Emperor Decius, was a capital offense. The Roman state viewed the refusal to participate in the imperial cult as an act of treason, and organized Christian communities were seen as seditious secret societies. According to the hagiography recorded by Gregory of Tours, Denis, along with his two companions, the priest Rusticus and the deacon Eleutherius, established a covert church. Their ministry was conducted in secret, likely in private homes or discreet locations away from the city's official center. Their success in gaining converts eventually attracted the attention of the Roman governor. Under the authority of the ongoing imperial persecutions, Denis and his companions were arrested, tried, and condemned to death for their faith. The site chosen for their execution was a hill north of the city, a place of pagan worship dedicated to Mercury, which would henceforth be known as Montmartre, the Mount of the Martyr. It was here that Denis was beheaded, an event that gave rise to the enduring legend of him as a cephalophore, a saint who miraculously carried his own severed head for several miles to the site of his desired burial. This powerful legend fueled the growth of the faith he had died for. The first Christian communities in Lutetia were clandestine and cautious. They met not in public basilicas, but in the Domus Ecclesiae, private houses adapted for worship, or gathered for funerary rites in the necropolises located outside the city walls, as Roman law afforded a degree of protection to burial grounds. Lutetia did not have the extensive network of catacombs found in Rome, but the subterranean limestone quarries that riddled the landscape south of the city provided isolated and secure locations for secret burials and memorial services. It was in these hidden gatherings, among the tombs of their martyrs and in the quiet anonymity of suburban villas, that the foundational roots of Christian Paris were established, a subversive faith slowly growing in the shadow of the imperial eagle. The civic prosperity of Lutetia was a provincial reflection of a larger imperial peace that began to disintegrate during the crisis of the 3rd century. From roughly 235 to 284 AD, the Roman Empire was racked by a near-continuous cycle of civil war, economic collapse, and foreign invasion. The Rhine frontier, which had long protected Gaul, buckled under the pressure of new Germanic confederations. Raiding parties of Franks and Alemanni, taking advantage of Roman legions being diverted to internal power struggles, began to penetrate deep into the Gallic interior. These were not migrations, but destructive military incursions aimed at plunder. Lutetia, an open and largely unfortified city situated on major roadways, became a target. The expansive and undefended public buildings on the left bank, once symbols of Roman security, now represented an acute vulnerability. In response to a particularly severe wave of invasions around 275 AD, the inhabitants of Lutetia made a dramatic and defining choice. The sprawling civilian settlement on the left bank was systematically abandoned. The forum, the baths, the theatre, and the arenas fell silent as the population retreated to the one naturally defensible position the city possessed, the Ile de la Cité. This strategic withdrawal marked a fundamental reversal in the city's development, from confident expansion to defensive consolidation. To secure this island refuge, a massive construction project was undertaken. A formidable defensive wall, approximately 3 meters thick and 6 meters high, was built around the entire perimeter of the island. The construction of this rampart was an act of urgent necessity, and its materials tell the story of the city's crisis. Lacking the time and resources to quarry new stone, the builders engaged in the widespread practice of spolia. They systematically dismantled the abandoned public monuments on the left bank, salvaging their stone blocks, columns, and decorative friezes to be used as raw material for the new wall. Carved altars, sections of the theatre's seating, and pieces of the forum's porticos were all incorporated into the foundations and fabric of the fortifications. This act transformed the Ile de la Cité from the city's original nucleus into a compact, heavily defended fortress. Lutetia was no longer an open Gallo-Roman town. It had become a militarized stronghold, a much smaller and more pragmatic urban entity prepared for an era of profound insecurity. As the formal structures of Roman administration in northern Gaul weakened, civic authority began to shift towards individuals whose power derived not from imperial appointment, but from moral and spiritual charisma. In this environment of decaying political order, Geneviève, a woman from a Gallo-Roman family in Nanterre, emerged as a figure of immense influence. Consecrated to a life of religious devotion in her youth by Germanus of Auxerre, a prominent Gallic bishop, Genevieve's reputation for piety, asceticism, and prophetic insight grew steadily. She was a private citizen, holding no official title, yet her spiritual authority commanded the respect and loyalty of the Parisian populace, eclipsing that of the city's nominal Roman officials. Her leadership was tested in 451 AD, a year of existential crisis for Gaul. The armies of Attila the Hun, having crossed the Rhine and sacked the city of Metz, were advancing on Paris. The news of their approach, accompanied by tales of their ferocity, created widespread panic. The city's magistrates and wealthy landowners, seeing no hope in military resistance against the formidable Hunnic force, prepared for a mass evacuation, intending to abandon Paris to its fate. It was at this critical moment that Geneviève intervened. Confronting the fleeing officials, she argued against the evacuation, delivering a series of public addresses that framed the crisis in spiritual terms. She prophesied that the cities the Parisians intended to flee to would be destroyed, while Paris itself would be spared by divine intervention if its people would turn to prayer and penance. This was a direct challenge to the established secular authority. Genevieve organized the women of the city into a collective of prayer and fasting, a form of spiritual defense aimed at securing God's protection. Her conviction and charisma were so powerful that she successfully persuaded the populace to remain within the fortified island. The men were convinced to stand ready to defend the walls, while the women engaged in continuous vigils. As history records, Attila's army did not attack Paris. For strategic reasons that remain a subject of historical debate, the Huns altered their course, bypassing the city and moving south towards Orléans, where they would eventually be confronted by a coalition of Roman and Visigothic forces. To the people of Paris, the outcome was a miracle, a direct result of Genevieve's intercession. The event irrevocably established her as the city's protector and, in time, its patron saint, demonstrating that in an age of imperial collapse, true leadership was now vested in figures of profound faith. The final formal collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD had little immediate impact on northern Gaul, where Roman authority had already evaporated. The territory was a fractured landscape controlled by local Gallo-Roman aristocrats and various Germanic groups. Into this power vacuum stepped the Salian Franks, a confederation of Germanic tribes led by a new, ruthlessly ambitious king, Clovis I, who ascended to power around 481 AD. His reign would be one of constant, strategic warfare aimed at consolidating a unified kingdom under his rule. In 486 AD, Clovis confronted and defeated Syagrius, the last independent Gallo-Roman ruler in the region, at the Battle of Soissons. This victory effectively extinguished the final remnant of Roman state power in Gaul and transferred control of the territory between the Loire and the Somme, including Paris, to the Franks. Clovis's most consequential decision was not military, but religious. Influenced by his Burgundian wife Clotilde, he converted to Nicene Christianity, the faith of the majority Gallo-Roman population and its powerful episcopal hierarchy. His baptism, traditionally dated to 496 AD, was a masterstroke of political strategy. It immediately distinguished him from other Germanic rulers, such as the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, who were Arian Christians, a sect considered heretical by the Catholic bishops of Gaul. This alignment secured Clovis the crucial support of the Church and the loyalty of his non-Frankish subjects, providing his conquests with a veneer of religious legitimacy. His subsequent military campaigns were framed as wars against heretics and pagans. After consolidating his northern territories, Clovis turned his attention south, launching a campaign against the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse. In 507 AD, at the Battle of Vouillé, his forces won a decisive victory, killing the Visigothic king Alaric II and annexing the wealthy province of Aquitaine. Returning from this triumph, Clovis made a decision that would shape the future of Western Europe. In 508 AD, he formally designated Paris as the capital of his new, expansive Merovingian kingdom. The choice was strategic. Paris was centrally located within his consolidated domains, possessed formidable defences on the Ile de la Cité, and controlled key trade routes along the Seine. Furthermore, it was a city with a growing Christian legacy, associated with Saint Denis and the recently deceased Saint Geneviève. By establishing his court there, Clovis grounded his new Frankish dynasty in the soil of Gallo-Roman tradition and Catholic faith, transforming the former Roman outpost into the political heart of the nascent kingdom of Francia. With Paris established as a royal centre, the Merovingian dynasty began a program of ecclesiastical patronage that would create new and powerful institutions shaping the city's destiny. Beyond the confines of the fortified Ile de la Cité, vast royal estates and forests were granted to the church, not merely for spiritual purposes, but as a means of consolidating power and administering territory. In the 6th century, Clovis's son, Childebert I, founded a major basilica to the west of the city, in a vast expanse of meadows, to house a relic he had acquired from Saragossa, the tunic of Saint Vincent. This institution would later be renamed Saint-Germain-des-Prés, after its influential bishop, Germain. Almost immediately, it became a beneficiary of immense royal largesse, receiving endowments of land that stretched across Gaul. This transformed the abbey into one of the largest and wealthiest landowners in the kingdom, a veritable economic and political state within the state. To the north of the city, the ancient burial site of Saint Denis underwent a similar transformation. While a shrine had existed there for some time, it was the Merovingian king Dagobert I in the 7th century who refounded it as a royal abbey, endowing it with unprecedented wealth and legal privileges. Dagobert established the tradition of royal burial at the abbey, a practice that would continue for centuries, making Saint-Denis the necropolis of French kings, and imbuing it with unparalleled political and symbolic importance. These great abbeys, situated outside the old city walls, became major centers of activity and settlement, drawing populations around them and effectively expanding the footprint of Paris. Their influence was not merely economic or political. In an age of declining literacy and the fragmentation of classical knowledge, these monasteries became the primary centers of learning and intellectual life. Within their walls, scriptoria were established where monks painstakingly copied and preserved religious texts, classical literature, and historical chronicles. This work of transcription was a vital act of cultural preservation, ensuring that the written heritage of antiquity was not lost. The monastic schools trained the clerical elite, who would go on to serve as administrators in royal and episcopal courts. The abbots of Saint-Denis and Saint-Germain-des-Prés were not just religious leaders, they were powerful feudal lords, key advisors to the king, and custodians of a legacy of learning that made their institutions the intellectual heart of the early medieval Frankish world. The transition of power from the Merovingian to the Carolingian dynasty in the mid-8th century marked a profound geopolitical reorientation of the Frankish realm, one that had immediate and lasting consequences for Paris. The new dynasty, emerging from the powerful Pipinid family of Austrasia, had its traditional power base in the eastern territories, near the Rhine frontier. When Pepin the Short deposed the last Merovingian king in 751 AD, and his son Charlemagne was later crowned emperor in 800 AD, the strategic focus of their vast empire shifted decisively eastward. Their primary military concerns were the subjugation of the Saxons, the administration of Lombardy, and the defense of the eastern borders. Consequently, Charlemagne established his principal capital at Aachen, a city strategically positioned to manage these new imperial priorities. This eastward shift in political gravity fundamentally altered the status of Paris. Having served as a key political and symbolic center under Clovis and his successors, the city was now relegated to the status of a provincial town. It was no longer a primary royal residence. The Merovingian palaces on the Île de la Cité, such as the Palais de la Cité, were largely abandoned by the imperial court and fell into a state of neglect, maintained but rarely visited by the monarch. The city's administrative importance diminished accordingly. While it remained the seat of a count, this official, the Count of Paris, was now a regional administrator appointed by a distant emperor, rather than a figure at the center of royal power. The city's economic life, once stimulated by the presence of the royal court and its vast network of patronage, entered a period of relative stagnation. Paris did not vanish, but its role was fundamentally redefined. Its significance became overwhelmingly ecclesiastical. The great abbeys of Saint-Denis and Saint-Germain-des-Prés, with their vast landholdings and intellectual prestige, continued to thrive, their power now largely independent of the city's secular fortunes. They, along with the city's bishop, became the de facto guardians of Parisian life and identity. The city itself, however, was no longer a driver of Frankish politics or culture. It had become a backwater, a quiet regional hub whose primary importance lay in its religious institutions and its past glory, waiting in obscurity as the great dramas of the Carolingian Empire unfolded hundreds of kilometers to the east. The provincial quietude of Paris was shattered in the 9th century by a threat that arrived not by land but by water, Viking longships, having raided coastal areas for decades, began to use the great rivers of Francia as highways for plunder deep into the interior. After a series of smaller raids, including a successful sack of the city in 845, a climactic confrontation began in November 885. A vast Viking fleet, numbering in the hundreds of vessels and carrying an army estimated in the tens of thousands, appeared before the Ile de la Cité. Their objective was not merely to raid Paris, but to force a passage further up the Seine to pillage the rich, undefended lands of Burgundy. The city's strategic position, once a logistical advantage, now made it a critical obstacle. The defense of the city rested not on a large professional army, but on the determination of its local leadership and a small garrison. The primary defenders were Count Odo of Paris and Bishop Goslin, who organized the resistance from the fortified island. The city's main defenses were two heavily fortified wooden bridges, the Grand Pont to the north and the Petit Pont to the south, each guarded by a stone tower. When the Viking leaders Sigfrid and Rollo demanded free passage and tribute, Odo and Goslin refused, initiating one of the most famous sieges of the era. The Northmen launched a massive, coordinated assault, employing siege engines including catapults and battering rams against the bridge towers. The small contingent of Frankish defenders held their positions with heroic resolve, repelling wave after wave of attacks. The siege dragged on for nearly a year, a grueling ordeal of attrition. The Vikings blockaded the city, leading to severe famine and disease among the population. The defenders managed to hold out, their resistance becoming a symbol of West Frankish resolve against the invaders. Finally, in the autumn of 886, the lumbering imperial army of the Carolingian emperor Charles the Fat arrived. But the Parisians' hope for a climactic battle was dashed. Instead of engaging the depleted Viking force, Charles negotiated a humiliating settlement. He paid the Northmen 700 pounds of silver and, most galling to the defenders, granted them the very thing they had fought to prevent: passage up the Seine to raid Burgundy. This act of political expediency destroyed the emperor's credibility and proved to be the siege's most significant outcome. The defenders had won a moral victory, but their emperor had betrayed it. Count Odo's reputation soared, and when Charles the Fat was deposed in 887, Odo was elected king of West Francia, marking the definitive shift of power from the failing Carolingian dynasty to the Robertian house that would one day become the Capetian kings of France. The political legacy of the Viking siege of 885-886 was the definitive decline of Carolingian authority in West Francia and the corresponding rise of the Robertian family, the descendants of Count Odo. For a century, the crown alternated uneasily between the two powerful houses, but by the late 10th century, the Carolingian line had dwindled to near impotence. The final Carolingian king, Louis V, died in a hunting accident in 987, leaving no direct heir. This created a succession crisis that forced the magnates of the kingdom, the dukes, counts, and bishops, to convene and decide the future of the Frankish throne. The assembly met at Senlis, not far from Paris, to deliberate. The primary Carolingian claimant was Charles, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Louis V's uncle. By hereditary right, his claim was the strongest. However, a powerful faction led by the influential Archbishop Adalbero of Reims argued for a radical departure from tradition. Adalbero, in a famous speech, contended that the throne was not a right of birth alone, but should be bestowed upon the most capable man to lead the kingdom. He systematically dismantled Charles of Lorraine's candidacy, painting him as a vassal of the German emperor and a man of poor character. In his place, Adalbero championed his own candidate, Hugh Capet, the Duke of the Franks and Count of Paris. Hugh was the head of the Robertian house and the most powerful noble in the kingdom, his authority firmly established in the strategically vital lands between the Seine and the Loire. Persuaded by Adalbero's arguments and recognizing the political reality of Hugh's power, the assembly elected him King of the Franks. On July 3, 987, Hugh Capet was crowned at Noyon, an event that formally initiated the Capetian dynasty. The immediate consequence of his election was monumental for Paris. The city was the heart of Hugh's personal domain, the source of his family's wealth and military power. By elevating the Count of Paris to the throne of Francia, the election permanently anchored the monarchy to the city. The Palais de la Cité on the island was re-established as the primary royal residence and the administrative centre of the kingdom, the Curia Regis or King's Court. Though the early Capetian kings were weak, their direct royal authority barely extending beyond their Parisian heartland, this act ensured that as the monarchy's power grew, so too would the power and importance of its capital. The era of Paris as a forgotten provincial town was definitively over. Its destiny was now inextricably bound to that of the French crown. While the Capetian kings slowly consolidated their political power, a different kind of authority was rapidly growing within Paris, one based not on land or military might, but on knowledge. The 12th century witnessed a surge of intellectual activity across Europe, and Paris became its undisputed centre. The foundation for this transformation was laid in the city's cathedral schools, particularly the one attached to Notre Dame and those of the great abbeys. These institutions, initially intended to train clergy, began attracting students from across the continent, drawn by the reputation of their masters. It was an informal, dynamic environment where learning was a public and often confrontational affair. The pivotal figure in this intellectual explosion was Peter Abelard. A brilliant and charismatic teacher, Abelard arrived in Paris around 1100 and revolutionized education with his emphasis on dialectic, or logic, as the key to understanding truth. He challenged the traditional method of rote memorization, instead advocating for critical inquiry. His famous work, Sic et Non, Yes and No, was a compilation of contradictory statements from the Bible and Church Fathers, designed not to undermine faith, but to force students to use reason and logic to reconcile apparent discrepancies. His lectures, held in public spaces on the left bank, were immensely popular, attracting thousands of students and establishing the area's reputation as a centre for scholarship. This burgeoning, unregulated community of scholars and students soon required a more formal structure. Sometime around 1150, the masters of the various Parisian schools formed a guild, or Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium, a corporation of masters and scholars. This was the genesis of the University of Paris. Its creation was an act of self-defense and self-regulation, designed to protect its members from the jurisdiction of local civic and ecclesiastical authorities, and to establish standardized curricula and degree requirements. Formal recognition solidified its independence. In 1200, King Philip II Augustus issued a charter granting the university's students legal immunities, effectively making them a privileged class. Even more crucial was the papal bull Parens Scientiarum of 1231 from Pope Gregory IX, which officially recognized the university's right to govern itself and, critically, the right to strike, or cease lectures, a powerful tool in its conflicts with local authorities. Paris was no longer just the capital of a kingdom, it had become the theological and philosophical capital of Christendom. As Paris solidified its identity as the intellectual capital of Europe, its primary church, the aging Cathedral of Saint-Étienne, was deemed increasingly inadequate. In 1160, Maurice de Sully was elected Bishop of Paris, and he embarked on a project of unprecedented ambition: to demolish the old Romanesque basilica and replace it with a new cathedral that would physically manifest the city's divine and royal importance. The project was conceived on a colossal scale, a testament to the new architectural style emerging in the Ile-de-France, which would later be known as Gothic. In 1163, in a ceremony likely attended by King Louis VII and Pope Alexander III, the first foundation stone for the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris was laid on the eastern end of the Ile de la Cité. The construction was a monumental undertaking, a project that would outlive its original patrons and architects. Continuing for nearly 2 centuries, quarries at the site of the modern-day catacombs and along the Bièvre River supplied the Lutetian limestone, which was transported to the island by barge and ox cart. An army of specialized craftsmen, master masons, stonecutters, sculptors, carpenters, and glassmakers labored for generations. The initial phases focused on the choir and ambulatory, completed around 1182, allowing the high altar to be consecrated. The construction of the nave followed, pushing westward across the island. It was during this phase that the builders of Notre Dame deployed a revolutionary structural solution to support the immense weight of the new high stone vaults, the flying buttress. This innovation was the key to the Gothic style. Previously, the outward thrust of heavy stone ceilings required thick, solid walls with small windows. The flying buttress, a graceful exterior arch, transferred this immense pressure from the top of the interior walls, across the side aisles, to massive piers on the outside of the building. This external skeleton freed the walls from their load-bearing function. It allowed master builders to pierce the structure with vast openings for stained glass windows, dissolving the stone into a framework for light. The interior of Notre Dame was thus able to soar to heights of over 33 meters, its nave illuminated by colored light in a way that was intended to evoke the divine presence. The completion of the western facade around 1225 and the 2 great towers by 1250 finalized the cathedral's iconic silhouette, a crown of stone for the Capetian capital. The ascension of Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, to the French throne in 1180 marked the beginning of a profound physical transformation for Paris. Philip was a pragmatic and unsentimental monarch, focused on the consolidation of royal power and the defense of his kingdom against rivals, particularly the English Plantagenets. He viewed his capital not merely as a residence, but as a critical strategic asset. One of his first and most impactful decisions concerned the city's infrastructure. According to a contemporary chronicler, while standing at a window in the Palais de la Cité, the king was overcome by the foul stench rising from the street below, where the churning wheels of a cart had disturbed the muddy, refuse-filled ground. Disgusted, he issued an edict to pave the city's main thoroughfares. Beginning around 1186, the primary streets, including the Grand Rue Saint-Martin and the Grand Rue Saint-Jacques, were surfaced with heavy sandstone blocks, a monumental public works project that improved sanitation and facilitated commerce. Philip's most ambitious project, however, was defensive. As he prepared to depart for the Third Crusade in 1190, he ordered the construction of a new, massive city wall to protect his capital in his absence. This was not a minor fortification, but an enormous enclosure that, for the first time, officially encompassed both the right and left banks. The wall of Philip Augustus was over 5 kilometers in length, approximately 9 meters high and 3 meters thick at its base, punctuated by some 77 defensive towers. On the right bank, the wall protected the commercial heart of the city, while the left bank section enclosed the growing university district. At its western edge, guarding the approach along the Seine, Philip constructed a formidable new fortress, the Louvre. Initially, it was not a palace, but a military keep, a stark symbol of royal authority with a massive central tower, serving as a secure treasury, an arsenal, and a state prison. Philip's relationship with the burgeoning university community was equally pragmatic. Following a violent brawl in 1200 between students and the king's provost that resulted in several deaths, the masters of the university declared a strike, threatening to leave Paris entirely. Recognizing the immense prestige and economic value the scholars brought to his capital, Philip intervened decisively. He issued a royal charter that granted the students and masters of the University of Paris a set of legal privileges, including immunity from the jurisdiction of secular courts. This act formally recognized the university as a self-governing corporation, securing its future in the city while simultaneously placing it under royal protection. By the end of his reign in 1223, Philip Augustus had fundamentally remade Paris, encasing it in stone, paving its arteries, and securing its status as Europe's premier centre of learning. The Wall of Philip Augustus was the city's new armour, but its most critical component was the buckle that secured it against the kingdom's greatest threat. That buckle was the Louvre. Sited deliberately on the right bank at the city's westernmost edge, the fortress was not designed for the comfort of kings, but as a formidable military installation. Its primary strategic purpose was to guard the downstream approach of the Seine, the direct route of invasion from Normandy, which was then under the control of Philip's great rivals, the English Plantagenet kings. The Louvre was conceived as a citadel, a point of ultimate defence that could hold out even if the city walls were breached, and a projection of royal power that loomed over the river approach. Construction began around 1190, concurrent with the new city wall. The design was a masterpiece of late 12th century military architecture. The fortress formed a near-perfect rectangle, measuring approximately 78 by 72 metres, its high curtain walls punctuated by 10 defensive towers. A wide, deep moat, fed by the waters of the Seine, encircled the entire structure, making a direct assault on the walls nearly impossible. The main entrance was through a fortified gatehouse, protected by a drawbridge and portcullis. This outer shell, however, was merely the first layer of defence. At the heart of the courtyard stood the fortress's true anchor, a massive cylindrical keep known as the Grosse Tour, or Great Tower. This was a structure of immense strength, 30 metres high and 15 metres in diameter, with stone walls over 4 metres thick at its base. It was physically separate from the outer walls, surrounded by its own protective dry moat, making it a final, impregnable redoubt. The Great Tower was not a residence, it was a state stronghold. Its lower levels served as a secure arsenal, stockpiled with weapons and armour for the defence of the capital. Its middle floors functioned as the royal treasury, safeguarding the kingdom's charters, archives, and financial reserves. The upper levels and dungeons served as a state prison, a place for the king's most important and dangerous enemies. For the next 2 centuries, the Louvre would remain this stark symbol of military and royal authority, a grim sentinel of stone and water, with the kings of France continuing to reside in the more comfortable Palais de la Cité. The reign of Louis IX, grandson of Philip Augustus, shifted the focus of royal patronage from military fortification to spiritual sanctification. Louis's personal piety was legendary, guiding his actions as a monarch and culminating in his eventual canonization as Saint Louis. His most significant contribution to the fabric of Paris was born from an opportunity to make his capital the undisputed center of Christendom. In 1238, the financially destitute Latin Emperor of Constantinople, Baldwin II, offered to sell the most sacred relics of the Passion, including the crown of thorns. For Louis, the acquisition was a matter of profound religious duty and immense political prestige. He purchased the crown for the astonishing sum of 135 livres tournois, a figure that dwarfed the cost of any building project of the era. In August of 1239, Louis, accompanied by his brother Robert of Artois, met the relic just outside Paris. In an act of unprecedented piety, the king removed his royal robes and shoes, and, dressed as a simple penitent, helped carry the sacred object barefoot into the city. Initially housed in the palace chapel, it was clear that such a monumental relic required a setting of equal significance. Louis commissioned the construction of a new chapel within the confines of the royal residence, the Palais de la Cité. The project was not merely to build a church, but to create a colossal reliquary, a container of stone and glass worthy of housing the crown of Christ himself. Construction of the Sainte-Chapelle began around 1242 and was completed with remarkable speed, consecrated in April of 1248. It is the finest surviving example of the Rayonnant phase of Gothic architecture, a style that emphasized structural lightness and an abundance of light. The design, often attributed to the architect Pierre de Montreuil, consisted of 2 superimposed chapels. The lower chapel, with its richly painted columns, served the staff and residents of the palace. But the upper chapel was the true marvel. Accessed by the royal family, its stone structure was reduced to a bare minimum, a slender skeleton of bundled columns and delicate tracery. This minimalist stone frame allowed the walls to be almost entirely dissolved into a breathtaking expanse of stained glass. 15 enormous lancet windows, each over 15 meters high, fill the nave and apse. They contain 113 individual panels depicting biblical history from Genesis through the Passion of Christ, culminating with the story of the relic's acquisition by Louis IX himself. The effect was to immerse the visitor in a transcendent space of coloured light, a physical representation of the heavenly Jerusalem. The Sainte-Chapelle was a private declaration of faith and power, cementing the Capetian monarchy's claim to divine right and transforming Paris into the preeminent repository of Christian sanctity. While kings and bishops built with stone and glass, a new power was building an empire of finance and faith from a base in Paris. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, known as the Knights Templar, had established their European headquarters not within the city walls, but in the marshy lands to the northeast. This area, the Marais, became the site of a vast fortified enclosure known simply as the Temple. It was a sovereign entity, a city within the city, with its own massive keep, church, and administrative buildings, answering not to the King of France, but only to the Pope in Rome. While their founding mission was to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, their role in Paris had evolved into something far more influential. The Templars became the preeminent bankers of Christendom. Their international network of preceptories created a secure system for transferring funds, making them the de facto treasury for the French monarchy and a trusted depository for the wealth of European nobility. The fortress of the Temple in Paris was less a monastery and more the most secure bank vault in the Western world. This immense wealth and transnational allegiance created an inevitable conflict with the ambitions of King Philip IV, called Philip the Fair. A cold and calculating monarch, Philip was obsessed with centralizing state power and was perpetually on the verge of bankruptcy from his wars with England and Flanders. He saw the Templars as a state within his state, an unaccountable power whose vast assets he coveted and whose independence he could not tolerate. The end came with shocking speed and brutality. In the pre-dawn hours of Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip's agents executed a secret, meticulously planned order. Across France, every Templar was to be arrested simultaneously. In Paris, the king's men stormed the Temple fortress, taking the knights, including their unsuspecting Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, completely by surprise. The charges fabricated against them were designed for maximum shock: heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross, and institutionalized sodomy. Under horrific torture administered by royal inquisitors, many knights confessed to these crimes. The ensuing trials were a years-long legal charade, orchestrated by the king to break the order and seize its assets. It culminated in March 1314, when Jacques de Molay and other Templar dignitaries were brought to a small island in the Seine, the Îlot Juif, and burned at the stake. Philip had eliminated his creditors, absorbed their wealth, and crushed the last great independent power in his kingdom. The intricate networks of trade and pilgrimage that had enriched Paris in the preceding centuries became the vectors of its greatest catastrophe. In the summer of 1348, the Bacillus Yersinia pestis, having travelled from Asia along the arteries of commerce, arrived in the city. The dense urban environment, with a population estimated at over 200, proved to be an ideal medium for the pandemic's spread. Transmitted by fleas on black rats, which thrived in the capital's narrow, unsanitary streets and timber-framed houses, the plague moved with terrifying efficiency through the populace. Contemporary accounts, such as those by the chronicler Jean de Venette, describe the swift onset of symptoms: high fever, delirium, and the appearance of painful buboes, the dark swellings in the lymph nodes that gave the Black Death its name. The existing social and medical infrastructure was completely overwhelmed. The physicians of the University of Paris, considered the finest in Europe, were powerless. Their theories, based on miasmas or unfavorable astrological conjunctions, offered no remedy. As the death toll mounted, the basic functions of the city collapsed. The courts ceased to operate, and the university suspended its lectures. The clergy who ministered to the sick and dying suffered catastrophic losses, creating a spiritual crisis alongside the physical one. At the plague's zenith, sources record as many as 800 burials per day. The city's primary cemetery, the Holy Innocents, was quickly exhausted, forcing the digging of vast anonymous mass graves outside the city walls. By the time the first wave subsided in 1349, Paris had lost between a third and a half of its inhabitants. The demographic collapse was immediate and profound, but the social and economic consequences would reverberate for generations. The immense loss of life created an acute labor shortage. Surviving artisans and peasants found themselves in a position to demand higher wages and better conditions, a shift that destabilized the traditional feudal economy. The psychological impact was equally transformative, breeding a new, pervasive preoccupation with mortality. The experience left the city's collective memory scarred, a demographic wound so deep that it would take more than a century for the population of Paris to return to its pre-plague levels. The city had survived, but it was a sparser, more somber version of the thriving metropolis it had been. The demographic wound of the plague had not yet healed when Paris was plunged into a new crisis, this one political and self-inflicted. The ongoing 100 Years' War with England served as a constant external threat, but the true danger emerged from within the French royal court itself. The periodic madness of King Charles VI created a power vacuum at the heart of the kingdom, which two rival factions of the royal family sought to fill. On one side were the Armagnacs, supporters of the king's younger brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans. On the other were the powerful Burgundians, led by the king's cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The simmering rivalry erupted into open civil war in 1407, when John the Fearless orchestrated the brutal assassination of Louis of Orleans on a Parisian street. The capital became the primary battleground for this internal conflict. Its powerful guilds, merchants, and the influential University of Paris largely favored the Burgundian faction, whom they saw as better protectors of the city's commercial interests and more capable of imposing order. This allegiance turned Paris into a Burgundian stronghold, but it also subjected the populace to waves of intense political violence. The city's streets witnessed brutal purges and massacres as control shifted between the two parties. The most notorious of these was the Cabochian Revolt in 1413, where the powerful Butchers' Guild, allied with the Burgundians, briefly seized control of the city and unleashed a reign of terror against suspected Armagnacs. This deep internal division provided the perfect opening for an external enemy. England's King Henry V, following his shattering victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, exploited the French Civil War to advance his own claim to the throne. The conflict reached its tipping point in 1419, when the Dauphin, the future Charles VII, orchestrated the murder of John the Fearless during a supposed peace negotiation on the bridge at Montereau. This act of treachery drove the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, into a formal alliance with the English. The result was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a document that disinherited the Dauphin and recognized Henry V as the legitimate heir to the French crown. In December of that year, English soldiers marched into Paris, not as conquerors, but as allies of the ruling Burgundian faction. The city that had fiercely resisted Viking invaders now found itself under foreign occupation, a direct consequence of its own bitter internal strife. The momentum of the 100 Years' War, which had favored the English for decades, was unexpectedly reversed in 1429 by the campaigns of a peasant girl from Domremy. Following her strategic victory in lifting the siege of Orléans and the subsequent coronation of Charles VII at Reims, Joan of Arc turned her attention to the most significant prize in the kingdom, the capital itself. In late August, the newly revitalized French royal army advanced on Paris, a city that had been under Anglo-Burgundian control for 9 years. The objective was to expel the English garrison and restore the capital to the French crown, a symbolic and strategic act that would effectively validate Charles VII's reign. However, the city was a formidable objective, protected by the robust walls of Charles V and defended by a seasoned English garrison commanded by John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford. The Parisian establishment, particularly the influential theologians of the university, remained deeply hostile to Charles VII and his Armagnac cause, viewing Joan not as a saviour but as a heretic. The assault commenced on the morning of September 8, 1429, targeting the western defences of the city at the Porte Saint-Honoré. This was one of the most heavily fortified sections of the wall, complete with a deep moat and powerful earthwork defences. Joan was at the heart of the action, leading the charge herself. With her banner in hand, she stood on the edge of the outer ditch, testing its depth with a lance and urging her soldiers forward into the attack. The fighting was intense, as the French troops struggled to cross the water-filled moat and scale the earthen ramparts under a constant barrage of arrows and cannon fire from the well-prepared defenders. The assault ultimately failed to breach the city's defences. During the afternoon, as she continued to direct the attack, Joan was wounded, struck in the thigh by a crossbow bolt. Despite her injury, she refused to withdraw and continued to call for a renewed push. But the French forces, having suffered heavy casualties, were demoralised, and their attack lost its impetus. She was carried from the field against her will as evening fell. The following day, despite Joan's desire to renew the assault, the Royal Council decided against it. King Charles VII, ever cautious and swayed by advisors who favoured diplomacy over protracted conflict, ordered a full retreat. The failure to take Paris was a severe blow to the momentum of Joan of Arc's campaign. It demonstrated that her presence was not a guarantee of victory, and marked the beginning of a decline in her influence at the French court. The capital would remain under English control until 1436, its liberation achieved not by a dramatic assault, but through political negotiation. The liberation of Paris was ultimately achieved not by force of arms, but through a fundamental realignment of political alliances. The crucial event occurred in 1435 at the Congress of Arras, where years of careful diplomacy by King Charles VII culminated in a reconciliation with Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. The treaty signed there formally ended the civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, and, in doing so, dissolved the Anglo-Burgundian alliance that had sustained the English presence in northern France for 2 decades. With the loss of Burgundian support, the English garrison in Paris became an isolated and untenable occupying force. The city they controlled was a shadow of its former self, its population diminished by war and disease, its economy crippled, and its infrastructure neglected. Public sentiment, which had once favoured the Burgundian cause, had soured on the English presence, worn down by heavy taxation and the hardships of occupation. The breaking point came in the spring of 1436. On April 13th, a popular uprising erupted within the city, coordinated with the approaching royal army led by Arthur de Richmont, the Constable of France. Parisian citizens overpowered the English sentries and opened the city gates, allowing Richemont's forces to enter with minimal resistance. The English garrison, numbering only a few hundred men, was completely outnumbered and retreated to the formidable fortress of the Bastille on the eastern edge of the city. A brief siege ensued, but recognizing the hopelessness of their position, the English commander negotiated a surrender. They were permitted to depart with their arms and possessions, marching out of Paris and leaving the city in French hands for the first time in 16 years. The process of recovery was methodical and slow. The city that welcomed the French crown was depopulated and impoverished. King Charles VII himself did not make his formal triumphal entry into his capital until November 1437, a year and a half after its liberation. His return symbolized the restoration of royal authority, but the practical work of reconstruction had only just begun. The king implemented a policy of amnesty, pardoning most Parisians who had collaborated with the Anglo-Burgundian regime in an effort to heal the deep political wounds of the Civil War. Efforts were made to repopulate the city, restore the authority of royal courts, and encourage the return of the merchants and artisans who were vital to its economic life. It was a gradual process of rebuilding not just stone and mortar, but the very social and political fabric of a capital long fractured by war and occupation. The accession of King Francois I in 1515 marked a definitive cultural turning point for Paris. The new monarch, young and ambitious, had been profoundly influenced by the art and culture he witnessed firsthand during his military campaigns in Italy. He returned with a determined vision to transform his capital from a Gothic city into a center of the Renaissance, rivaling the great city-states of the Italian peninsula. His reign was characterized by an unprecedented level of royal patronage that actively imported Italian artistic and intellectual currents directly into the heart of France. The most symbolic act of this policy was his invitation to Leonardo da Vinci in 1516. The aging master was given the title of first painter, architect and engineer to the king and installed at the Château du Clos-Lucé near the king's residence at Amboise. While Leonardo undertook no major commissions for Paris itself, his presence in the royal court provided the king with direct access to the mind of a quintessential Renaissance man, fundamentally shaping the monarch's own aesthetic and architectural ambition. This new vision began to physically reshape Paris. In 1528, Francois I made the momentous decision to make the Louvre Palace his primary residence in the city, initiating its slow transformation from a grim medieval fortress into a grand royal palace. The first and most symbolic act was the demolition of the Grosse Tour, the massive central keep built by Philip Augustus, which erased the most prominent feature of the Louvre's military past. He later commissioned the architect Pierre Lescot to design a new wing in the purely classical style, a project that would replace the western section of the old fortress and set the standard for French Renaissance architecture. The king's ambition extended to civic structures as well. In 1533, he approved plans for a new city hall, the Hôtel de Ville, to replace the dilapidated medieval building. The design was entrusted to the Italian architect Domenico da Cortona, known as Boccador, who created a spacious and elegant structure in the new style, a testament to the city's growing administrative importance and wealth. This cultural project was not limited to stone. The king also sought to reshape the city's intellectual life. In 1530, he founded the Collège des Lecteurs Royaux, later known as the Collège de France, creating a new humanist institution independent of the conservative theological doctrines of the University of Paris, where subjects like Greek and Hebrew could be studied freely. The architectural vision of Francois I was not confined to concepts. It was realized in stone and mortar through two pivotal projects that redefined the Parisian landscape. The first was the fundamental reimagining of the Louvre. In 1528, the king declared the old fortress his principal Paris residence, signaling a definitive shift in its function. The most dramatic gesture of this change was the 1527 order to demolish the Grosse Tour, the great central keep built by Philip Augustus 3 centuries earlier. This formidable circular tower, a potent symbol of medieval defensive architecture, was razed to its foundations, physically and symbolically clearing the ground for a new kind of royal dwelling, one built not for siege, but for spectacle and governance. The definitive transformation began in 1546 when the king commissioned architect Pierre Lescot to create a new residential wing. Lescot, in collaboration with the sculptor Jean Goujon, designed a facade for the western side of the Cour Carrée that was a masterwork of the French Renaissance. It replaced the somber medieval curtain wall with a structure defined by classical principles of symmetry, harmony, and proportion, featuring Corinthian pilasters, ornate pediments, and niches filled with allegorical statues. This Lescot wing became the benchmark for a new French architectural style, a sophisticated blend of Italian classicism and native French tradition. Simultaneously, the civic heart of the city was being reborn. The old medieval city hall, a cramped building known as the Maison aux Piliers, was no longer adequate for the administration of a rapidly growing capital. In 1533, Francois I approved the construction of a new Hôtel de Ville on the Place de Grève. The design was conceived by the Italian architect Domenico da Cortona, who envisioned a building that would express the city's wealth and dignity. His plan called for a grand, light-filled structure with a symmetrical facade, large windows, and elegant ornamentation, a stark departure from the utilitarian and enclosed nature of Gothic civic buildings. The construction, though not completed for nearly a century, established a new architectural language for Parisian municipal power. Together, the conversion of the Louvre and the founding of the new Hôtel de Ville represented a conscious effort to remake Paris. One project transformed the symbol of royal authority from a military stronghold into a refined palace, while the other provided the city's administration with a headquarters that mirrored the grandeur and classical ideals of the new age. While Paris was being physically reshaped by Renaissance ideals, its spiritual foundations were being fractured by the intellectual currents of the Protestant Reformation. The theological arguments of Martin Luther and other reformers, disseminated with unprecedented speed by the printing press, found a receptive audience within the city's literate circles, particularly among the students and masters of the university and the emerging merchant class. Initially, these new ideas were debated as matters of scholarly inquiry within the humanist environment fostered by Francois I. However, the doctrines of justification by faith alone and the supreme authority of Scripture directly challenged the theological monopoly of the Catholic Church and the Sorbonne, the powerful faculty of theology at the University of Paris. Small clandestine groups began to form, meeting in private homes and workshops to read the Bible in French translation and to discuss the works of reformers, most notably the French theologian Jean Calvin. These secret congregations, whose adherents would become known as Huguenots, operated in an atmosphere of increasing risk. The turning point from intellectual debate to open persecution came in October 1534 with the affair of the placards. Overnight, Protestant activists posted broadsheets in Paris and other major cities, one even appearing on the door of the king's own bedchamber at the Château d'Amboise, denouncing the Catholic Mass as idolatry. This act of public defiance was perceived as a direct attack on both the sacred tenets of the faith and the authority of the monarchy. King Francois I, who had previously shown a degree of tolerance, responded with severe repression. The first public executions of heretics by burning at the stake took place in Paris in early 1535, marking the beginning of a systematic campaign to eradicate the new faith. This crackdown institutionalized the religious divide. Special courts were established to prosecute heresy, most notoriously the one nicknamed the Chambre Ardente, or Burning Chamber, for the frequency of its death sentences. An atmosphere of suspicion permeated the city, as neighbors were encouraged to inform on suspected Protestants. The once unified religious landscape of Paris was now irrevocably split. The Catholic majority, spurred on by militant preachers, viewed the Huguenots as a seditious threat to both spiritual salvation and social order. The Protestant minority, forced to worship in secret and facing the constant threat of arrest and execution, developed the resilient and tightly knit community structures that would sustain them through the decades of violent conflict that were to follow. The city had become a crucible of religious tension, a stage being set for the coming wars of religion. The religious tensions that had simmered for decades within Paris erupted into an unprecedented wave of violence in the late summer of 1572. The catalyst was an event intended to foster peace, the marriage of the Catholic Princess Marguerite de Valois to the Protestant leader, Henry of Navarre. This union brought the Huguenot nobility to the capital in great numbers, creating a fragile atmosphere of reconciliation within a city that remained a bastion of militant Catholicism. This fragile peace was shattered on August 22nd when an assassination attempt was made on the influential Huguenot leader Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Though the admiral was only wounded, the attack created immediate panic and suspicion among the Huguenot leadership, who demanded justice and protection from the king, Charles IX. The royal court, fearing a Protestant reprisal and potential coup, convened in a series of desperate councils. Under the influence of his mother, Catherine de' Medici, and other Catholic nobles, the young king was persuaded to authorize a preemptive strike to eliminate the Huguenot leaders. The plan was set in motion before dawn on August 24th, the feast of Saint Bartholomew. The ringing of the bell at the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois near the Louvre served as the signal. The first victim was Admiral de Coligny himself, murdered in his bed, and his body defenestrated onto the street below. Royal guards and the retinues of Catholic nobles then moved systematically through the Louvre and the surrounding district, hunting down and killing the Huguenot aristocrats who had been guests at the royal wedding. What began as a targeted political assassination rapidly devolved into a city-wide massacre. The Paris city militia was mobilized, and the Catholic populace, incited by years of radical preaching, joined in the slaughter. The violence became indiscriminate, with Huguenot men, women, and children being dragged from their homes and killed in the streets. The Seine became a repository for the dead, its waters thick with bodies for days. For 3 days, the carnage continued unabated in Paris, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 people. The violence did not remain contained within the city walls. As news spread, similar massacres were unleashed in a dozen other French cities. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre irrevocably destroyed any possibility of religious reconciliation and became the single most infamous event of the French Wars of Religion. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre failed to extinguish the Huguenot cause and instead plunged France into a new phase of civil war, culminating in a complex succession crisis known as the War of the Three Henrys. This conflict involved the reigning monarch, King Henry III, the Protestant heir, presumptive Henry of Navarre, and the leader of the ultra-Catholic League, Henry, Duke of Guise. Within Paris, the Catholic League held absolute power, backed by a zealous populace and the financial support of Philip II of Spain. They were determined to prevent the Protestant Henry of Navarre from ever ascending to the French throne. The conflict escalated dramatically when King Henry III, having been driven from his own capital by the Duke of Guise, orchestrated the assassination of the Duke in late 1588. This act shattered the Catholic League's leadership but galvanized their opposition to the crown. In retaliation, a Dominican friar assassinated King Henri III in August 1589. With his dying breath, the king officially recognized Henry of Navarre as his legitimate successor, who now became King Henry IV. However, being the legitimate king and ruling from the capital were two different matters. Paris, firmly in the hands of the Catholic League, refused to accept a Protestant monarch. Henri IV was thus forced to lay siege to his own capital. In 1590, his royal army encircled the city, cutting off all food supplies. The ensuing blockade was one of the most harrowing in the city's history, lasting for more than 4 months. The population endured extreme famine, with chronicles recording citizens resorting to eating cats, dogs, and even ground bones to survive. The siege was ultimately broken not by a military assault, but by the intervention of a Spanish army under the Duke of Parma, forcing Henry IV to withdraw. The experience demonstrated to the new king that Paris could not be taken by force alone, its loyalty had to be won. After years of continued conflict, Henri IV made a pragmatic political calculation. Recognizing that the vast majority of his subjects, and Parisians in particular, would never accept a Protestant king, he resolved to convert. This decision was famously summarized in the apocryphal phrase, "Paris is well worth a mass." In July 1593, at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, Henri IV formally abjured Protestantism and was received into the Catholic Church. This act dismantled the ideological foundation of the Catholic League's resistance. In March 1594, the gates of Paris were opened, and Henry IV entered his capital peacefully, finally uniting the kingdom and bringing the long and devastating wars of religion to a close. The reign of Henri IV's son, Louis XIII, was defined not by the king's own personality, but by the formidable intellect and political will of his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. Ascending to the royal council in 1624, Richelieu became the architect of a new phase in French statecraft, systematically working to subordinate all centres of power to the absolute authority of the crown, which was now unequivocally centred in Paris. His primary objectives were threefold: to dismantle the political and military autonomy of the Huguenots, to break the power of the great regional nobles, and to counter the influence of the Habsburg dynasty abroad. In Paris, his vision was of a capital that was not just a royal residence, but the engine of a centralized and culturally unified France. This project of state building required both military action and profound institutional innovation. Richelieu's campaign against the Huguenots was not a renewal of the religious wars, but a calculated political move to eliminate their status as a state within a state which had been granted by the Edict of Nantes. The most significant action was the successful siege of La Rochelle, which ended in 1628 and stripped the Huguenots of their military strongholds and political assemblies, though it preserved their freedom of worship. Simultaneously, the cardinal relentlessly pursued and suppressed aristocratic conspiracies, making it clear that noble power was derived from service to the king, not from hereditary right. In Paris, this consolidation was mirrored by the city's growing administrative importance. Richelieu himself commissioned the construction of the Grand Palais Cardinal, a residence of such magnificence that it rivaled the Louvre, and, upon his death, was bequeathed to the crown, becoming the Palais Royal. Perhaps the most enduring of Richelieu's initiatives for Paris was the formal establishment of the Académie Française in 1635. He saw that a unified state required a unified language, free from regional dialects and standardized in its grammar and vocabulary. The Academy was charged with this monumental task: to give certain rules to our language and to render it pure, eloquent, and capable of treating the arts and sciences. Its 40 members, known as the Immortals, began the decades-long work of compiling the first official dictionary of the French language. This was a project of cultural engineering on a national scale, directed from the capital. Under Richelieu's guidance, Paris was being deliberately transformed from the political heart of a feudal kingdom into the intellectual and administrative brain of a modern, absolute state. The deaths of Cardinal Richelieu and King Louis XIII, in quick succession, left the French crown on the head of a 4-year-old child, Louis XIV. The regency was entrusted to his mother, Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, the Italian-born Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin, a protégé of Richelieu, was determined to continue his predecessor's policies of centralizing state power and raising taxes to fund the ongoing war with Spain. This continuation of deeply unpopular policies, without Richelieu's formidable authority, created a volatile political environment. The high nobility, long resentful of their loss of feudal power, saw an opportunity to reclaim their influence. At the same time, the Parlement of Paris, the city's highest court, resisted the crown's fiscal edicts, claiming the traditional right to review and approve royal legislation. This widespread opposition erupted in 1648 into a series of protracted civil wars known as the Fronde. The conflict began with the Fronde of the Parlement, where judges and Parisian bourgeois erected barricades in the city streets, protesting Mazarin's new taxes. The unrest escalated into the Fronde of the Princes, a more dangerous rebellion led by some of the highest-ranking nobles in the kingdom. For the young Louis XIV, these were formative years of profound instability and personal humiliation. He witnessed Parisian mobs storming the royal palace and, most traumatically, was forced to flee his own capital with the royal family in the middle of the night. These experiences instilled in the young king a deep-seated distrust of the Parisian populace and a lifelong determination to never again be subject to the whims of rebellious nobles or the pressure of a volatile capital. When Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, the 22-year-old Louis XIV declared that he would rule without a chief minister, initiating a new era of personal, absolute monarchy. His political project was shaped entirely by the memory of the Fronde. The nobility had to be controlled, and the seat of power must be insulated from Paris. He found the Louvre, located in the heart of the city, to be an unsuitable and insecure residence. His solution was to transform his father's modest hunting lodge at Versailles, a village safely removed from the capital, into the most spectacular palace in Europe. The decision was a calculated political masterstroke. By moving the court and the entire apparatus of government to Versailles in 1682, Louis XIV physically separated the monarchy from Paris. He further neutered the aristocracy by compelling them to live at Versailles, where their status depended on royal favour and their energies were consumed by intricate court etiquette, leaving Paris as the kingdom's great metropolis, but one now living in the shadow of the Sun King's distant, brilliant court. While the royal court orbited the Sun King at Versailles, Paris itself was undergoing a profound transformation, becoming not a neglected backwater, but the undisputed cultural and intellectual capital of Europe. This evolution was not accidental, but the result of deliberate state policy, managed by Louis XIV's capable ministers, who understood that the greatness of the kingdom required a magnificent and orderly metropolis. The most visible of these changes was the systematic introduction of public street lighting. In 1667, under the authority of the First Lieutenant General of Police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, a vast network of lanterns was installed throughout the city's streets and squares. This edict mandated that thousands of glass-paned lanterns, each holding a candle or oil lamp, be lit from dusk until dawn during the winter months. The initiative was a matter of public order, designed to deter crime and make the city navigable after dark. But its effect was revolutionary, giving Paris its enduring nickname, La Ville Lumière, the City of Lights, more than a century before the advent of gas or electric lamps. This era of urban improvement was matched by an unparalleled cultural flourishing, particularly in the theatre. The playwright Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, known as Molière, defined the age with his sharp comedies of manners that satirized the affectations of the aristocracy and bourgeois. Though he performed regularly for the court at Versailles, his troupe was based in Paris at the theatre of the Palais Royal, where Parisians flocked to see works like The Misanthrope and Tartuffe. The period also saw the perfection of French classical tragedy in the works of Jean Racine and Pierre Corneille, whose plays dominated the stage at the Hôtel de Bourgogne. This theatrical golden age was institutionalized in 1680, when Louis XIV, by royal decree, merged the city's two leading acting troupes to form the Comédie Française, the world's first national theatre company, solidifying Paris as the center of dramatic arts. The city's intellectual life was also formally organized and elevated through the creation of new royal academies. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the king's finance minister, oversaw the founding of the Academy of Sciences in 1666, the Royal Academy of Music in 1669, and the Academy of Architecture in 1671. These institutions, headquartered in the capital, brought together the kingdom's leading minds to advance knowledge in a structured, state-sponsored manner. Colbert also commissioned the construction of the Paris Observatory, equipping it with the finest instruments of the age. Even as the king held court miles away, his ministers ensured that Paris remained the vibrant heart of French civilization, a city illuminated by new lights, new ideas, and the brilliance of a new theatrical age. The death of Louis XIV in 1715 released a current of intellectual energy that had been constrained by the rigid orthodoxies of his long reign. In the 18th century, Paris transformed from a city of royal academies into the vibrant heart of a pan-European intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. The primary engine of this transformation was not a formal institution, but a unique social invention, the Parisian salon. These were regular gatherings, hosted in the elegant drawing rooms of aristocratic and bourgeois women known as salonières, where the leading thinkers of the age, the philosophes, could mingle with artists, nobles, and foreign dignitaries to debate the most pressing questions of science, politics, and philosophy, away from the censorship of the court and the Sorbonne. In the salons of figures like Madame Geoffrin and Madame du Deffand, a new public sphere of critical reason was born. Central to these gatherings was the presence of François-Marie Arouet, better known as Voltaire. His weapon was a formidable wit, which he deployed in countless plays, essays, and letters to attack religious intolerance, judicial injustice, and the abuses of the Ancien Régime. His ideas on reason and freedom of speech, often forcing him into exile, made him the most famous and feared intellectual in Europe. In contrast, Jean-Jacques Rousseau offered a more radical and ultimately more disruptive critique of society. His writings, particularly The Social Contract, argued that legitimate government could only arise from the general will of the people, a direct challenge to the divine right of kings. He questioned the very foundations of a society based on private property and inequality, becoming a profoundly influential voice for a new political order. The most ambitious project to emerge from this intellectual ferment was the Encyclopédie, a monumental effort to compile all human knowledge. Edited primarily by the philosopher Denis Diderot, with contributions from thinkers across France, including Voltaire and Rousseau, its goal was far more radical than simple information gathering. It sought to organize knowledge based on human reason rather than divine revelation, implicitly undermining the authority of both the monarchy and the Catholic Church. The project was a constant battle against censorship. Its volumes were suppressed by royal decree and condemned by the Pope. Yet Diderot and his collaborators persisted for over 20 years, completing the final volumes in 1772. The Encyclopédie was the Enlightenment's great intellectual weapon, a multi-volume testament to the power of rational inquiry, printed and disseminated from Parisian workshops to readers across the continent, systematically laying the intellectual foundations for revolution. In the final decades of the Ancien Régime, the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment flowed through a city fractured by profound and visible inequality. The social structure of Paris was a study in contrasts, where immense wealth was concentrated in the hands of a hereditary aristocracy and a burgeoning financial elite, while a vast and growing population of artisans and labourers lived in a state of constant economic precarity. The nobility, insulated by a system of legal and fiscal privileges, were largely exempt from the kingdom's most burdensome direct tax, the taille. They resided in opulent private mansions, known as hotels particuliers, which they constructed in exclusive new districts like the Faubourg Saint-Germain, creating a geography of wealth in the city's western quarters that stood in stark opposition to the densely populated working-class faubourgs in the east. For the majority of Parisians, life was dictated by the price of bread. Grain, the foundational staple of their diet, accounted for the largest portion of a working family's budget. A poor harvest or speculation by merchants could cause the price of a £4 loaf to skyrocket, pushing hundreds of thousands from subsistence into destitution. This population of wage earners, craftsmen, and shopkeepers, who would later be known as the sans-culottes, faced not only the threat of hunger, but also an increasingly deregulated labour market that offered little security. The old guild system, which had once provided a degree of stability, was weakening, leaving workers vulnerable to fluctuating wages and unemployment. This social chasm was exacerbated by the monarchy's own fiscal crisis. The French state was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, crippled by the enormous debts incurred from a series of expensive wars, most notably its financial support for the American Revolution. The tax system was fundamentally broken, unable to tap into the immense wealth of the clergy and nobility, and therefore placing the entire fiscal burden upon the Third Estate, the common people. The visible opulence of the court at Versailles and the Parisian aristocracy was thus directly subsidized by the hardship of the masses. The philosophical arguments for liberty and rights, once debated in the salons, now found a receptive audience in a populace that experienced the tangible injustices of inequality, hunger, and a system of privilege that seemed both irrational and unsustainable. Faced with the imminent collapse of the state's finances, King Louis XVI made a momentous decision, reviving a political body that had not been convened for 175 years. In 1789, he summoned the Estates General, an ancient feudal assembly composed of three orders: the First Estate, representing the clergy, the Second Estate, the nobility, and the Third Estate, encompassing everyone else. The very act of calling this assembly electrified Paris, transforming the city's simmering discontent into a formal political debate. Across the capital, citizens gathered to draft their cahiers de doléances, or lists of grievances, a process that systematically documented the widespread desire for fiscal reform and constitutional limits on royal power. The city was inundated with a flood of political pamphlets, most famously Abbé Sieyès' What is the Third Estate?, which argued forcefully that the common people were not merely one order among three, but were in fact the nation itself. As the delegates gathered at Versailles in May, the central procedural question became whether they would vote by order, which would allow the two privileged estates to outvote the third, or by head, which would give the more numerous Third Estate a decisive advantage. When the deadlock on this issue proved insurmountable, the delegates of the Third Estate took a revolutionary step. On June 17th, they declared themselves the National Assembly, an indivisible body representing the French people. 3 days later, finding themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court and swore a solemn oath not to disband until they had established a new constitution for the kingdom. This act, the tennis court oath, was a direct and unprecedented challenge to the principle of absolute monarchy. Back in Paris, the atmosphere grew tense. The king responded to these events with ambiguity, but his actions stoked the city's fears. He began to concentrate troops, many of them foreign mercenaries, in a ring around Paris and Versailles. Then, on July 11th, he dismissed his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker, who was seen by many as the only official sympathetic to their cause. News of Necker's dismissal reached the city the next day, interpreted by the populace as the prelude to a royal coup, a military action to dissolve the National Assembly and crush the burgeoning revolution. Orators in the gardens of the Palais Royal called the people to arms. The gathering storm was no longer a matter of debate, it was a question of survival, and all eyes turned to the city's great symbol of royal despotism, the medieval fortress of the Bastille. The dismissal of Jacques Necker catalyzed the Parisian population into action. By the morning of July 14th, 1789, the primary objective for the revolutionary crowds was the acquisition of arms to defend the city against the anticipated royalist assault. A massive throng descended upon the Hôtel des Invalides, a veterans' hospital with a substantial armory. They successfully seized tens of thousands of muskets, but found very little gunpowder. The search for this essential component of warfare led them eastward, to the gates of the Bastille. This formidable medieval fortress was more than just a state prison. It was a potent symbol of monarchical despotism and, critically, it housed a vast quantity of the city's gunpowder reserves. The crowd that gathered before its imposing stone walls was not initially intent on its destruction, but on securing those munitions. Delegations from the Revolutionary Committee at the Hôtel de Ville attempted to negotiate with the fortress's governor, the Marquis de Launay. They requested that he withdraw the cannons aimed at the city streets and hand over the gunpowder. De Launay, commanding a small garrison of veteran soldiers supplemented by Swiss mercenaries, refused to surrender the fortress but promised not to fire unless attacked. As negotiations dragged on, the crowd grew larger and more impatient. A small group managed to climb a wall and lower the outer drawbridge, allowing the mass of people to flood into the courtyard. At this point, misunderstandings and fear led to the outbreak of violence. The garrison opened fire on the crowd, turning the chaotic demonstration into a bloody siege that raged for several hours. The tide of the battle turned decisively when mutinous soldiers from the Gardes Françaises, the Royal Infantry Regiment, arrived with cannons they had taken from the Invalides. These trained soldiers provided the artillery and tactical discipline that the civilian crowd lacked, systematically bombarding the fortress walls. Facing a full-scale assault and a potential massacre of his men, Delaunay capitulated. The drawbridge was lowered, and the revolutionaries stormed inside. They found only 7 prisoners within its cells. The victory was less a military achievement than a symbolic one, but its immediate consequences were visceral. Delaunay was captured, marched toward the Hôtel de Ville, and killed by the mob en route. His head was severed and paraded through the streets on a pike. The fall of the Bastille was the definitive act that shattered royal authority in Paris. It was the physical manifestation of the people's will and the unequivocal beginning of the French Revolution. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 marked a point of no return, radicalizing the French Revolution as it faced escalating threats from both within and without. The young republic was now at war with most of Europe, while counter-revolutionary uprisings flared in regions like the Vendée. In Paris, this atmosphere of crisis and paranoia fueled the ascent of the Montagnards, the most radical faction of the Jacobin Club. To confront these existential dangers, the National Convention created new and powerful instruments of state control. The most significant of these was the Committee of Public Safety, established in April 1793. Initially intended as a temporary war cabinet, it rapidly evolved into the de facto executive government of France, wielding near-dictatorial power over the military, judiciary, and legislature. Dominating the committee was the figure of Maximilien Robespierre. A lawyer from Arras, he articulated the chilling philosophy that would underpin the terror, that the new republic could only be forged through a combination of virtue and terror. Virtue, for Robespierre, was the selfless devotion to the republic. Terror was the swift and inflexible justice required to eliminate its enemies. To administer this justice, the Revolutionary Tribunal was established, a court designed to try suspected counter-revolutionaries. Its procedures stripped away traditional legal protections, and its verdicts were final with no possibility of appeal. The legal framework for this systematic repression was codified in the Law of Suspects in September 1793, which created an exceptionally broad definition of who could be considered an enemy of the state, enabling the arrest of hundreds of thousands on the flimsiest of pretexts. The chosen instrument for this state-sanctioned violence was the guillotine, a mechanical decapitator designed for efficiency and, in the eyes of its proponents, a more humane method of execution. Its blade fell daily on the Place de la Révolution, today's Place de la Concorde. The executions became a grim public spectacle, a routine part of Parisian life. The terror consumed not only royalists and aristocrats, but people from every social class, including prominent revolutionaries like Georges Danton, who were accused of insufficient revolutionary fervor. From the autumn of 1793 through the summer of 1794, this system of organized terror held Paris and the nation in its grip, a period where the ideals of liberty were systematically suppressed in the name of defending the revolution itself. The volatile decade of the French Revolution concluded with the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, which brought General Napoleon Bonaparte to power as first consul. With this act, the period of political instability gave way to one of centralized authority. After crowning himself Emperor of the French at Notre Dame Cathedral in 1804, Napoleon embarked on a systematic project to remake Paris into a capital befitting his new European empire. His explicit vision was to create a modern successor to ancient Rome, a city whose monuments and infrastructure would project an image of unparalleled power and permanence. This was not merely an aesthetic endeavor, but a calculated political program to legitimize his reign and celebrate the glories of his armies. Napoleon's interventions were twofold, combining monumental grandeur with practical urban improvements. To address the city's chronic sanitation and water issues, he commissioned the Canal de l'Ourcq, a massive engineering project that brought fresh water from the River Auque into the heart of the capital. Feeding new public fountains like the Fontaine du Palmier on the Place du Châtelet, he ordered the construction of new stone quays to contain the Seine, built the city's first iron bridge, the Pont des Arts, and laid out new, wider streets such as the Rue de Rivoli. His administration also established a more logical system of street numbering, with even and odd numbers on opposite sides of the street, a practical reform that replaced the chaotic and inconsistent methods of the past. Alongside these utilitarian projects, he initiated the construction of a series of monuments directly inspired by classical Rome. He commissioned the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel to serve as a new gateway to the Tuileries Palace, and, more famously, ordered the construction of the colossal Arc de Triomphe at the Place de l'Étoile to commemorate the victories of his Grande Armée. To immortalize the Battle of Austerlitz, he had the Vendôme column erected, its bronze plating forged from the melted cannons of captured Austrian and Russian armies, in direct imitation of Trajan's column in Rome. The Church of the Madeleine was redesigned as a temple to the glory of the Grand Army, a classical temple in the Greco-Roman style. He continued the transformation of the Louvre, creating the Musée Napoleon, a public museum whose collections were vastly expanded with artworks seized during his military campaigns across Europe. This act turned a former royal palace into the world's greatest public art repository and a testament to French imperial might. His architects, Charles Parisii and Pierre Fontaine, defined the opulent empire style, applying it to new constructions like the Bourse, the city's new stock exchange, which was also designed as a Roman temple to commerce. This relentless program of construction and reform left an indelible imperial stamp on the city, establishing a blueprint for authoritarian urban planning that would be expanded upon by his successors. Napoleon's vision for an imperial capital moved beyond singular monuments to the creation of grand urban perspectives, using streets and arches to impose a new classical order upon the medieval city. The most significant of these projects was the Rue de Rivoli, initiated in 1802. Conceived by his chief architects, Charles Parisii and Pierre Fontaine, it was designed not merely as a thoroughfare, but as a monumental statement. It ran in a perfectly straight line, a disciplined axis of power connecting the Place de la Concorde to the Louvre and the Tuileries Palace. Its northern facade was mandated by law to be uniform, featuring a continuous arcaded gallery at the ground level, a design that provided a sheltered promenade for pedestrians and imposed a visual regularity previously unknown in Paris. This street was a demonstration of centralized planning, a stark contrast to the winding, narrow lanes that characterized the old city, and its width was also a strategic consideration, suitable for the rapid movement of troops through the capital. To celebrate his victories, Napoleon commissioned 2 triumphal arches, each serving a distinct purpose. The first, the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel, was completed between 1806 and 1808. Positioned directly before the Tuileries Palace, it served as a ceremonial entrance, a modern Porta Triumphalis. Its design by Parisii and Fontaine was a direct emulation of the Arch of Septimius Severus in Rome, complete with rose-coloured marble columns and detailed bas-reliefs depicting the military successes of the 1805 campaign. Originally, it was crowned by the horses of St. Mark, the famed bronze quadriga Napoleon had taken as war booty from Venice, a tangible symbol of his conquests. While the Carousel Arch was a monument to immediate victory, the second arch was a promise of eternal glory. In 1806, Napoleon decreed the construction of a far grander monument at the Place de l'Étoile, the Arc de Triomphe. Standing at a colossal 50 meters high, it was designed by Jean-Charles Grin to dwarf its Roman precedents, particularly the Arch of Titus. Its immense scale and prominent location at the nexus of 12 avenues ensured it would dominate the city's western horizon. The project was so ambitious that only the foundations were complete by the time of the empire's collapse. Construction would halt and restart for decades, finally being completed in 1836 under King Louis-Philippe. Its surfaces were conceived as a stone register of the empire's military history, with the names of 660 generals and over 100 battles inscribed upon its inner and outer facades, permanently etching the Napoleonic epic into the landscape of Paris. The apex of Napoleon's imperial power was shattered by the catastrophic invasion of Russia in 1812. The Grande Armée, a multinational force of over 600 men, the largest European army ever assembled to that date, crossed the Niemen River in June. The campaign that followed was not decided by a single battle, but by a war of attrition. The Russian forces, under the command of Mikhail Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, employed a scorched earth policy, retreating deep into Russian territory while destroying supplies and infrastructure. The French captured a deserted and burning Moscow in September, but this victory was hollow. Lacking winter quarters and facing a logistical collapse, Napoleon was forced to begin the infamous retreat in October. The Russian winter, combined with constant harassment from Cossack cavalry and partisans, systematically destroyed the army. Of the initial invasion force, fewer than 100 soldiers staggered back across the Niemen River. This disastrous outcome shattered the myth of Napoleonic invincibility and triggered the formation of the Sixth Coalition, a pan-European alliance dedicated to his final overthrow. Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Great Britain joined Russia, mobilizing armies that dwarfed the new forces Napoleon was able to raise. Throughout 1813, the war was fought in Germany, culminating in the decisive Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, where the coalition armies inflicted a crushing defeat upon Napoleon. With Germany liberated, the Allies prepared to carry the war into France itself. In early 1814, multiple armies crossed the Rhine, advancing on Paris from the northeast. Despite a series of brilliant tactical victories by Napoleon during the 6 Days campaign, his depleted forces could not halt the strategic advance of the overwhelmingly superior Allied numbers. The final defense of the capital fell to Marshals Auguste de Marmont and Édouard Mortier, who commanded a hastily assembled force of Imperial Guard units, regular troops, and National Guardsmen. On March 30, 1814, the Battle of Paris was fought in the hills and suburbs surrounding the city, with the main defensive efforts concentrated at Montmartre. The French forces resisted for several hours, but faced with the prospect of the city's complete destruction, Marshal Marmont negotiated a surrender. The following day, March 31st, Tsar Alexander I of Russia and King Frederick William III of Prussia led their armies into the capital. The occupation was largely peaceful, as the Tsar presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, bringing peace to Europe. A few days later, at the Palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated his throne, bringing an end to the First French Empire and paving the way for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. The fall of the First Empire did not halt the city's momentum, but rather channeled it into new forms of transformation. The first half of the 19th century saw Paris slowly embrace the Industrial Revolution, less through the large-scale factories of Britain, and more through the intensification of workshop production in its eastern faubourgs. Districts like the Faubourg Saint-Antoine swelled with artisans and labourers, their narrow streets now home to the production of textiles, chemicals, and luxury goods. This burgeoning industrial economy was physically connected to the rest of the nation by a new technology, the railway. In 1837, the first passenger line was inaugurated, linking Paris from the Gare Saint-Lazare to the suburb of Le Pec near Saint-Germain-en-Laye. This was the beginning of a network that would soon radiate from the capital, cementing its economic dominance and acting as a powerful magnet for migrants from across France, who poured into the city seeking work. This rapid growth, however, occurred within the confines of a largely medieval city, creating a dangerous imbalance. The population density in the central arrondissements reached unprecedented levels, with families crowded into squalid, unventilated tenements. The lack of a modern sewer system meant that waste was often thrown directly into the streets or flowed into the Seine, the primary source of drinking water. These conditions provided a fertile ground for disease, and in 1832, disaster struck. A global cholera pandemic reached Paris, spreading with terrifying speed through the contaminated water supply. The epidemic killed nearly 20 Parisians in a matter of months, exposing the lethal consequences of the city's inadequate infrastructure and creating widespread panic and social distrust. These simmering social pressures found their political outlet in recurrent revolutionary upheaval. The July Revolution of 1830 saw 3 days of street fighting, known as Les Trois Glorieuses, where Parisians erected barricades and overthrew the restored Bourbon monarchy of Charles X, replacing him with the more liberal citizen king, Louis Philippe. Yet this change primarily benefited the wealthy bourgeoisie, leaving the working classes disenfranchised and their grievances unaddressed. The discontent continued to build for nearly 2 decades, culminating in the February Revolution of 1848. Once again, the streets of Paris became a battleground of barricades. This uprising toppled the monarchy of Louis Philippe and established the short-lived Second Republic, an event that sent shockwaves of revolution across Europe and set the stage for the rise of a new Napoleon. The political vacuum created by the 1848 revolution was filled by a figure who skillfully invoked the legacy of the First Empire. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon I, was elected President of the Second Republic with an overwhelming majority, capitalizing on his famous name and a public desire for order after years of turmoil. For 3 years, he navigated the complex politics of the Republic, but his ambitions extended far beyond the limits of a single presidential term. On December 20, 1851, the anniversary of his uncle's coronation and victory at Austerlitz, he executed a meticulously planned coup d'état. The army occupied key points in Paris, dissolved the National Assembly, and arrested prominent political opponents. A tightly controlled plebiscite was quickly organized, granting him the authority to draft a new constitution. 1 year later, following another referendum, the Second Republic was formally dissolved, and Louis Napoleon was proclaimed Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, establishing the Second Empire. His regime was a new form of government, sometimes termed Caesarism, which combined authoritarian rule with popular sovereignty expressed through plebiscites. The early years were marked by significant political repression. The press was subjected to strict censorship, public meetings were curtailed, and a powerful secret police monitored and suppressed dissent. Political opponents, including prominent figures like Victor Hugo, were forced into exile. Yet, this authoritarian structure was paired with a dynamic and forward-looking economic policy. Napoleon III's government actively promoted industrial capitalism, believing that economic prosperity would ensure social stability and national glory. This period witnessed an unprecedented economic boom, fueled by state-supported infrastructure projects and financial innovation. The government guaranteed investments in the rapid expansion of the national railway network, which more than quintupled in length during the Second Empire, solidifying Paris as the undisputed hub of the nation's commerce and transport. New investment banks, most notably the Crédit Mobilier, founded by the Parisii brothers, were established to channel private savings into large-scale industrial ventures, from mining companies to transatlantic shipping lines. The emperor also championed free trade, signing the landmark Cobden-Chevalier Treaty with Britain in 1860, which lowered tariffs and stimulated competition. This combination of political control and economic dynamism created a climate of immense prosperity, particularly for the bourgeoisie, and provided the financial and political power necessary for the most radical and comprehensive transformation of Paris ever undertaken. The economic dynamism of the Second Empire provided the means, but the physical transformation of Paris required a specific instrument of imperial will. In 1853, Napoleon III found that instrument in Georges-Eugène Haussmann, whom he appointed prefect of the Seine. Haussmann was not an architect or an urban planner, but a ruthlessly efficient and loyal administrator with a talent for finance and a complete lack of sentimentality for the old city. The emperor gave him a clear mandate: to aerate, unify, and embellish Paris. This directive launched a 17-year project of urban renewal so vast and destructive it was later termed Haussmannization. The core of the strategy was the creation of a new legal framework that permitted the state to expropriate private property on an unprecedented scale, not just for the path of a new street, but for the entire blocks on either side. This power was essential for the project's financial model, as the city could resell the cleared land to private developers at a profit, who were then required to build in a uniform, state-approved style. With this authority, Haussmann's workers began a process of urban surgery. Entire swaths of medieval Paris, particularly the dense, overcrowded, and unsanitary warren of streets in the city's core and on the Ile de la Cité, were systematically demolished. Thousands of buildings, some dating back centuries, were reduced to rubble. This process was controversial and socially disruptive, displacing an estimated 350 people. The working-class residents who had inhabited these central neighborhoods for generations were forced out, unable to afford the rents in the new grand apartment buildings, and pushed towards the newly annexed peripheral districts of Belleville and Ménilmontant. In place of the demolished neighborhoods, Haussmann carved long, wide, and remarkably straight boulevards through the urban fabric. These arteries, such as the Boulevard de Sébastopol, Boulevard Saint-Germain, and Avenue de l'Opéra, served multiple purposes. They were designed to improve traffic circulation, connecting the new railway stations to the city centre, and to promote public health by bringing light and fresh air into previously dark and fetid districts. Critically, their width and straightness were also a direct response to the revolutionary barricades of 1830 and 1848. These new avenues made it impossible to block the city and allowed for the rapid deployment of troops and artillery to quell any future insurrection. This radical and authoritarian redesign created the visual identity of modern Paris, a city of grand vistas and uniform stone facades. But it was achieved through the wholesale destruction of its past and the displacement of its historic population. The era of imperial grandeur and reconstruction ended abruptly in the summer of 1870. A diplomatic dispute with Prussia over the Spanish succession was skillfully manipulated by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, provoking Napoleon III into declaring a war for which the French army was unprepared. The subsequent Franco-Prussian War was a swift and catastrophic failure. On September 20, at the Battle of Sedan, the main French field army was decisively defeated, and Emperor Napoleon III himself was captured. When this news reached Paris 2 days later, the Second Empire collapsed without resistance. Crowds gathered to demand a new government, and at the Hôtel de Ville, the Third Republic was proclaimed, vowing to continue the war and defend the nation. However, the victorious Prussian armies were already advancing, and by September 19th, they had completely encircled Paris, beginning a siege that would last for more than 4 months. Life within the besieged capital deteriorated rapidly. Cut off from all outside supplies, the city faced systematic starvation. As the winter progressed, the food supply dwindled to nothing. Parisians consumed the animals in the zoo, then their horses, and eventually the city's cats, dogs, and rats. The constant threat of Prussian artillery bombardment added a layer of psychological terror to the physical hardship, with shells falling indiscriminately on residential neighborhoods. The only connection to the outside world was through a daring system of manned balloons, which carried mail and government officials out of the city, and carrier pigeons, which brought messages back. After several failed military attempts to break out, and with the population suffering from famine and disease, the government of national defense capitulated, signing an armistice on January 28, 1871. The humiliation of defeat and the profound suffering of the siege had radicalized much of the Parisian population. Deep resentment grew towards the new national government, led by Adolphe Thiers, which was seen as conservative and collaborationist. This tension ignited on March 18, 1871, when Thiers sent army units to seize the cannons of the Paris National Guard, a citizen militia that had defended the city. The soldiers were met by crowds of civilians, who persuaded them to refuse their orders. The government fled the city for the safety of Versailles, and a radical, independent government known as the Paris Commune was elected. For 2 months, the Commune implemented a program of progressive social reforms, but its existence was short-lived. In late May, the Versailles army launched a full-scale assault on the city. The ensuing conflict, known as the Bloody Week, was a period of horrific violence. The army advanced through the streets, executing suspected communards on the spot. In response, the cornered communards executed their hostages, including the Archbishop of Paris, and set fire to symbols of the old regime, destroying the Tuileries Palace and the Hôtel de Ville. The repression was merciless, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 Parisians. A brutal end to the uprising that left deep political scars on the city for decades to come. Following the trauma of the Commune, Paris entered a period of remarkable stability and growth under the newly solidified Third Republic. This era, lasting from roughly 1871 until the outbreak of war in 1914, would later be known as the Belle Époque, the Beautiful Era. It was a time defined not by conflict, but by a prolonged peace in Western Europe, rapid industrial and technological progress, and an unprecedented flourishing of the arts. The city became the undisputed cultural capital of the world, a center of innovation and optimism. This golden age was powered by the Second Industrial Revolution, which introduced transformative technologies into daily life. Electric lighting began to replace gas lamps on the grand boulevards and in public buildings, extending the life of the city into the night and giving Paris its lasting nickname, La Ville Lumière, or the City of Light. The first automobiles appeared on the streets, the telephone system was established, and the Lumière brothers held their first public film screening in the city in 1895, inventing the cinema. This prosperity gave rise to a new consumer culture, epitomized by the grand department stores like Le Bon Marché and Printemps, which offered a vast array of goods to a growing middle class in opulent, cathedral-like settings. The period was also marked by a series of spectacular expositions universelles, or World's Fairs, which showcased French industrial and cultural prowess. The 1889 exposition, held to commemorate the centenary of the Revolution, was distinguished by its radical and controversial centerpiece, the Eiffel Tower. Intended as a temporary structure, Gustave Eiffel's iron lattice tower became the enduring symbol of the city's modernity. The 1900 exposition further transformed the cityscape with the construction of the Grand Palais, the Petit Palais, and the ornate Pont Alexandre III Bridge. Artistically, the Belle Époque was a period of revolutionary change. A group of young painters, including Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Edgar Degas, rejected the rigid historical subjects of the official salon and took their easels outdoors. They sought to capture the fleeting effects of light and the candid moments of modern Parisian life, a boat trip on the Seine, a bustling boulevard, a dancer backstage at the opera. When they held their own independent exhibition in 1874, a critic mockingly labeled their work Impressionism after Monet's painting, Impression Sunrise. The name stuck, and the movement would redefine Western art. At the same time, the Art Nouveau style emerged, championed by Hector Guimard, whose sensuous, plant-inspired entrances for the new Paris metro brought modern design to the masses, completing the image of a city at the zenith of its cultural and technological confidence. To celebrate the centenary of the French Revolution and showcase its own industrial and republican vitality, the Third Republic planned its most ambitious Exposition Universelle for 1889. A central feature was to be a monumental tower, over 300 meters tall, a feat of engineering never before attempted. A competition was held, and the winning design came from the firm of Gustave Eiffel, a renowned bridge builder. The concept, initially developed by his engineers Maurice Koechlin and Émile Nouguier, was a radical departure from traditional masonry. It proposed a soaring pylon of wrought iron, a lattice of prefabricated parts, designed with the mathematical precision of a bridge support, engineered to resist wind pressure through its very transparency. The project was immediately and fiercely controversial. A committee of 300, comprising the most prominent figures of the Parisian art and literary world, including Charles Gounod, Guy de Maupassant, and Alexandre Dumas the Younger, published a furious open letter. They decried the proposed tower as a useless and monstrous structure, a black and gigantic factory chimney that would humiliate the city's revered monuments like Notre Dame and the Arc de Triomphe with its barbarous mass. Despite the elite artistic outcry, construction began in January 1887. The project was a marvel of modern industrial logistics. Over 0 individual pieces of puddled iron were manufactured with extreme precision at a factory in the Parisian suburb of Levallois-Perret. Each piece was designed so that the rivet holes would align to within 1/10 of a millimeter. These components were then brought to the Champ de Mars construction site and hoisted into place by steam-powered cranes that crawled up the tower's own legs. A team of just 300 workers on site undertook the complex task of assembly, connecting the ironwork with 2.5 million thermal rivets. The construction progressed at a remarkable pace, with the tower rising at an average of 12 meters per month. The entire structure was completed in just 2 years, 2 months, and 5 days, a testament to the efficiency of Eiffel's methods. When the exposition opened on May 6, 1889, the tower was its undeniable centerpiece, the tallest man-made structure in the world. Yet its existence was intended to be fleeting. Eiffel's contract stipulated that the tower was to be dismantled after 20 years. Its survival was ultimately secured not by its popularity as a tourist attraction, but by its utility. Eiffel actively promoted its scientific applications, installing a meteorology lab at its summit. Most decisively, its height made it an invaluable platform for the new science of radiotelegraphy. As a permanent wireless telegraph station, its strategic importance for military communications became undeniable, saving the Iron Lady from demolition and cementing its place as the permanent symbol of the Parisian skyline. The Belle Epoque shattered in August 1914, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the subsequent cascade of alliances. Germany declared war on France. The initial response in Paris was a wave of fervent patriotism, with crowds cheering the mobilizing soldiers departing from the Gare de l'Est, confident in a swift victory. This optimism quickly faded as the German army executed its Schlieffen Plan, sweeping through neutral Belgium and northern France with alarming speed. By early September, the German First Army had crossed the Marne River and was within 30 kilometers of the capital. The French government, fearing the city's capture, evacuated to Bordeaux, leaving General Joseph Gallieni as the military governor of a city bracing for a siege. The critical moment came during the First Battle of the Marne. A gap had opened between the German First and Second Armies, and French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre saw an opportunity for a counterattack. The French Sixth Army needed to be moved rapidly to the front to strike the exposed German flank, but conventional transport was insufficient. In an unprecedented act of logistical improvisation, General Gallieni made a decision that would become legendary. On the evening of September 7th, he requisitioned the city's fleet of Renault Agon taxis. Around 600 cabs were ordered to assemble at Les Invalides, where they were loaded with soldiers from the 7th Infantry Division. Driving through the night, the taxis ferried approximately 6,000 troops to the front lines. Militarily, the numbers were small in the context of the massive battle, but their arrival at a critical point helped to reinforce the French line and surprised the German command. The miracle of the Marne succeeded. The German advance was halted, and Paris was saved. The quick victory hoped for in 1914 did not materialize. The front line stabilized into a vast network of trenches, and Paris settled into 4 grueling years as a wartime capital. While the fighting was distant, the war was a constant presence. The city was shelled by long-range German artillery, including the infamous Paris gun in 1918, which could fire shells from over 120 kilometers away, causing civilian casualties and widespread anxiety. Zeppelin airships and later Gotha bombers conducted nighttime raids, forcing Parisians into the metro stations for shelter. The city became a massive hospital, with hotels and public buildings converted to care for the endless stream of wounded soldiers from the front. With millions of men mobilized, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, particularly in the munitions factories that sustained the war effort. Life was defined by rationing, shortages, and a grim, enduring resilience that lasted until the final armistice in November 1918. The armistice of 1918 brought a profound silence, followed by a frenetic and desperate embrace of life that defined the post-war decade in Paris. Known in France as Les Années Folles, or the Crazy Years, the 1920s were a period of intense social and artistic experimentation, fueled by a collective reaction against the horrors of the Great War. A new generation sought to break entirely with the past, giving rise to avant-garde movements that challenged every convention. Dadaism, born in wartime Zurich, found a fertile ground in Paris, using absurdity and anti-art to mock the bourgeois logic that had led to the conflict. This soon evolved into surrealism, formally launched by André Breton's 1924 manifesto, which sought to unlock the power of the unconscious mind through the art of individuals like Max Ernst and Man Ray. The soundtrack to this era was jazz. African-American soldiers had introduced its syncopated rhythms to France during the war, and in the 1920s, it exploded in the clubs and dance halls of Montmartre and Montparnasse. Venues like Le Grand Duc and Bricktops became centers of a vibrant new nightlife. The era was personified by the American performer Josephine Baker, who became an overnight sensation with her electrifying performances at the Théâtre des Champs, Élysée, and later the Folies Bergère, her Danse Sauvage embodying the period's fascination with the exotic and the uninhibited. This liberated atmosphere, combined with a highly favorable currency exchange rate against the American dollar, made Paris an irresistible magnet for a wave of expatriate writers and artists, particularly from the United States, where the cultural climate was perceived as restrictive and puritanical, especially after the onset of Prohibition in 1920. This group, famously dubbed the Lost Generation by the writer and salonière Gertrude Stein, found in Paris the freedom to create and live on their own terms. Stein's own apartment at 27 Rue de Fleurus became a crucial meeting point, where emerging American writers could mingle with established European artists like Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse. The expatriate literary scene revolved around 2 distinct poles. The cafés of Montparnasse, such as La Rotonde, Le Dôme, and La Coupole, served as informal offices and social hubs for writers like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ezra Pound. Here, they debated, drank, and developed the lean, modernist prose that would define American literature. The other vital center was Sylvia Beach's English-language bookshop, Shakespeare and Company, on the Rue de l'Odéon. It functioned as a lending library, post office, and publisher for the expatriate community, most notably taking on the immense risk of publishing James Joyce's controversial and groundbreaking novel, Ulysses, in 1922, when it was banned in both the United States and the United Kingdom. For a brief, incandescent decade, Paris was the undisputed center of the Western creative world. The creative energy of the interwar years dissolved into apprehension with the rise of Nazi Germany. In May 1940, the German blitzkrieg shattered the defenses of France. As the Wehrmacht advanced with shocking speed, the French government fled south, declaring Paris an open city on June 10th to spare it from the destruction that had befallen Warsaw and Rotterdam. On June 14th, 1940, German troops marched into a silent and stunned capital, beginning 4 years of occupation. The city was systematically repurposed for the German war machine. The swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower and the Hôtel de Ville, while the German High Command established its headquarters in the grand hotels of the Place de la Concorde and the Rue de Rivoli. Daily life for Parisians was immediately transformed by German decrees imposing a strict curfew, severe rationing of food and fuel, and the constant presence of an occupying army. This period of occupation was marked by a quiet and dangerous undercurrent of opposition. From its small beginnings, the French resistance grew into a complex network. Its activities ranged from the clandestine printing and distribution of anti-German newspapers like Combat and Liberation, to the gathering of military intelligence for the Allies and organizing escape lines for downed airmen. More overt acts of sabotage targeted railways and German supply lines, carried out at immense personal risk. The occupiers and their collaborationist French auxiliaries responded with brutal repression. The persecution of the city's Jewish population escalated systematically. Following the mandatory wearing of the Yellow Star, a decisive and tragic moment arrived in July 1942 with the Veldiv roundup, where French police, acting on German orders, arrested over 13 Jewish men, women and children, imprisoning them in the Velodrome d'Hiver before their deportation to Auschwitz. The beginning of the end came with the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944. As Allied armies pushed across France, the resistance in Paris prepared for insurrection. On August 19th, the French Forces of the Interior, FFI, launched a city-wide uprising, and Parisians began erecting barricades in the streets. The German military governor, General Dietrich von Choltitz, received direct orders from Adolf Hitler to destroy the city's bridges and landmarks rather than let it fall into Allied hands. In a now famous act of defiance, Choltitz disobeyed the command. As fighting intensified, lead elements of General Leclerc's French Twand Armored Division, followed by the American 4th Infantry Division, raced towards the capital. They entered the city on the evening of August 24th. The next day, General von Choltitz formally surrendered the German garrison at the Hotel Meurice. On August 26th, General Charles de Gaulle led a triumphant and emotional parade down the Champs-Élysées, confirming to the world that after 4 years of darkness, Paris was once again free.